Hello. This is an analysis of Fallout 3, and this is going to be quite a long video. You could tell that from the title, thumbnail, and timecode. If this is going to be an issue for you, then why did you click on this video in the first place? Now I want to start off this video with a bit of a disclaimer. This likely won't apply to most people who watch this video, and most of the people who this does apply to have likely already paused the video and are already typing their comments with total disregard for the content of this video. So this might end up being a moot point, but this is something I still wanted to discuss anyways. Yes, this is a very long video. Tough shit. Either watch it or don't, but I really don't give a shit if anyone thinks this video is too long. I simply take as much time as necessary to talk about the things I want to talk about. The result could be a 5-minute long video or a 12-hour long video. But regardless, these discussions will take as long as they need to. My goal here is to talk in depth about the subject, and length simply isn't a concern for me. Could I be more concise with my arguments and points I'm making? Certainly. I'm still learning how to do this whole YouTube thing, and it will likely be a continual process. Already I look back on my older videos and see areas where I could improve, or where I do things differently, and that will likely be the case for this video a year from now, as I continue to learn and grow. Continual improvement is always the goal, but being concise doesn't mean making a short video. It simply means explaining things more clearly and efficiently, rather than rambling on a subject. I realize many people will decide to never watch this video simply on the basis of its sheer length, and that's absolutely fine and understandable. I have no expectations of anyone to watch this video, unless of course their intent is to respond to it. Shouting that it's too long isn't a criticism. Neither is pointing out how old this game is, which is another argument I've seen that I really don't care about. Criticism is valid regardless of how old something is, and there's certainly value to some people in discussing media regardless of its age. There's no time limit on being able to talk about something. Entertainment media does not expire, it does not have a due date, and there's not a set limit of time in which you are allowed to discuss something in relation to its release. This video could have been made 5 months after Fallout 3's release or 500 years. What matters is the quality of the content of both the game and the video criticizing it, not the length of time since its release. The idea that you can't or shouldn't criticize something because it's old is ridiculous, and is little more than the equivalent of telling someone to shut up because you don't like what they have to say. If this video was 5 hours of praise towards Fallout 3 instead, the same people who have gotten angry at the criticism would instead revel in how it defends and praises the game regardless of its length and time since release. Apparently there's no time limit on praising or defending something, but criticism has a hard cutoff date and length. And if you don't talk about something before then, or within the universally agreed allotted time for criticism, then you're shit out of luck. But luckily for myself and the people who do enjoy this kind of content, the people who make these empty criticisms only have the power to shout impotently into the void. It's okay. Your feelings on this matter are valid. I just don't care about them. Additionally, this is my first proper video since reaching 1,000 subscribers, so I want to again thank everyone for the support I've received on this channel so far. I never expected to make it this far, and it really means a lot to me. I also wanted to mention quickly that I do try to respond to comments as much as possible, and I absolutely appreciate receiving criticism of my work. It's a way for me to improve or correct mistakes I've made. As mentioned, I'm still learning a lot about how to handle making these videos, and I feel like I've learned a lot since the first part of the Fallout 4 analysis. Additionally, I have a Discord server now. I was hesitant on making one since I've never run a server and I don't really have time to, but a few people volunteered to moderate it, and I suppose it would be nice to have a sort of community with the people who are interested in my content, or in discussing these games and movies and stuff. The link is in the description. With that out of the way, I want to state up front that I do not hate Fallout 3, I actually do still like it to some degree. Largely due to nostalgia, as it was my first Fallout game, but there are many flaws with it that warrant discussion. Previously in my analysis series of Fallout 4, I had said that Fallout 3 could have been excused as a rushed fuck-up bastard child made for the sake of Bethesda planting their flag in the series, once they had come to own it, and I wanted to elaborate on that. Fallout 3 is an extremely flawed game for a great many reasons that will be covered in this video, among which are the general lack of choice and in some cases freedom, the poorly written story and antagonists, and general dumb goofiness that only seems to serve as a hindrance to the overall world, especially when combined with its poorly written and developed story that ends up making Fallout 3 feel more like a mediocre fan game by people who didn't truly understand what Fallout was all about, which in all honesty isn't too far from the truth. I've heard it described as an amusement park with Fallout can of paint, and that's really the best descriptor for this game. Fallout 3 as it is might have been excusable if they followed it up with a really strong entry to the series that was more in line with the original concepts, tone, and ideals of the original games, and this ended up coming in the form of Fallout New Vegas, though it was not developed by Bethesda, but by Obsidian instead, which was composed of a number of people who did work on the originals. While Fallout 3's flaws began to become more apparent with age, and with New Vegas to compare it to, which had excelled in storytelling, choice, characterization, and its RPG mechanics, among other aspects, the ball was now in Bethesda's court to course correct and take the series to new heights with the lessons that could be learned from New Vegas. That, unfortunately, never happened, and the true Bethesda follow-up we got to Fallout 3 ended up being disastrous in the most important aspects of what a Fallout game is. The lore and history, the storytelling, the world building, the characters, and the RPG mechanics. Besides graphics, combat, and some quality of life improvements, Fallout 4 was a massive step down from New Vegas, and even Fallout 3 in almost every way. Instead of Fallout 3's legacy being that of a rushed and deeply flawed but still somewhat enjoyable game, instead became cemented as not only another rung in the ladder of Bethesda's descent into pure incompetence, but the turning point from Bethesda's games going from good to bad. Bethesda is a company I used to love very much, but it's been clear to me for a long time now that the quality of their games has been steadily decreasing with each iteration, a constant downward spiral, and it seems as though many people were blind to this until Fallout 4 or even Fallout 76. And even so, some people still refuse to believe there's anything wrong with Bethesda or their game design. But I suppose I'm getting a little off topic here, and Bethesda's descent into making increasingly terrible games is something that will be covered further through other analysis series I have planned. But that's in the distant future. I suppose I should just get on with this. As with most of these kinds of analysis, I feel it's best to start at the beginning, and that is naturally the opening cutscene that all mainline Fallout games have. In all honesty, this intro is fairly well handled for the most part, even if it doesn't add anything to what was established in the two previous games. The intro to Fallout 1 established the destructiveness and impact of war, and how it never changes. It describes the events that led to the war that destroyed civilization, and it explains that great vaults were built, which saved some people from the destruction. With Fallout 2's intro, it begins by reintroducing the fact that a lack of resource led to war, but describes a much more detailed and harrowing picture of how civilization was wiped out. Fallout 3's intro basically describes that war has always been a part of our species and culture, and there's always some kind of justification for it to those who wage wars. Then it goes on to reiterate how the world was destroyed by nuclear fire, same as the previous two games. And it really makes sense to explain this aspect for anyone who may be new to the series, which was a particularly big deal for Fallout 3, as it was not only the first mainline Fallout game in a decade, but it was made by Bethesda, who by this point had been established as a pretty good developer with their Elder Scrolls games, in particular Morrowind and Oblivion, and as such they had a sizable fanbase that would follow them into this game. The intro continues to explain the concept of vaults, and this is where things start to take a turn for the worse. In the previous games, the Ron Perlman intros were just a narration to explain some backstory to how the world reached the state we see it in, and the intro to Fallout 3 largely does the same, but it makes a bit of a fatal flaw right at the end. After being a neutral voice up until this point, the narrator suddenly and blatantly lies to us about Vault 101, stating outright that Vault 101 never opened, no one ever enters, and no one ever leaves, and that you were born here. Now there's obviously story reasons for this happening, but it could have been very easily handled in such a way that didn't include the destruction of a neutral narrator, and turning him into a liar for no good reason. It could have been said by a character at any point during the overly long and unnecessary introduction sequence, but for whatever reason, they decided to have the narrator say it and turn him from a neutral voice that explains what happens into an unreliable narrator who intentionally deceives you. This is kind of a big deal because it brings everything he says into question. He lied here, so why wouldn't he lie elsewhere? Realistically, Bethesda probably won't turn the narrator lying into a regular thing, and yet, while I type these words into the script for the video, I can't help but imagine this line aging poorly. But the problem here is the inconsistency. To take an example from outside Fallout, the title crawls in Star Wars never outright blatantly lied to the audience in order to deceive them. They exist as a sort of primer to convey basic information to the viewer, so they can have a basic understanding of what is going on and why. But they were never used to establish a plot point in order to deceive the viewer. For Fallout, changing this aspect is especially bad since the payout on this aspect is barely touched upon, and you can reach within 5 minutes of leaving the vault. It's not even really treated as a big revelation, you're just kinda told about it. Why take such a bold step to deceive the audience, if the ultimate impact of this fact is the equivalent of a cliff note on the overall story? Why ruin the neutral narration for something that's revealed within a few minutes of leaving the vault? This also undermines the impact of actually leaving the vault, when it was thought to be impossible. It's less of a momentous occasion, as it's something that's happened before. I understand it's required as part of the story, as Liam Neeson was working on a water purifier in the wasteland prior to the start of the game, and that's his reason for leaving, but it does take away from the impact of leaving. It also raises a big question of why the vault is even able to be opened, as it was part of Vault Tech's experiment to see what would happen to people locked underground long term. They could have designed the door to intentionally close and be impossible to reopen, similarly to how the vault door for Necropolis was flawed so as to never close. As far as I'm concerned, this is the first big indicator of a larger issue Bethesda has, an issue that has only grown exponentially since then, and that's the fact that it seems all Bethesda can understand are the surface level details of Fallout, without any of the depth, complexity, or nuance, and increasingly veering to the style over substance issue. While this is really just the start of the issue, this will grow into a monster by the time the main story ends. After the intro, we're treated to whatever the fuck this is. Yeah, this is a weird one. It's certainly memorable for the fact that it's the only game I've ever seen that starts with your character's literal birth, but this is also the start of something else truly terrible, and I don't just mean this entire game itself. Apparently what the writers were going for was a story that begins with your birth and ends with your death, which is fine on paper, and maybe even for a different game or series. But this comes saddled with a huge issue that basically destroys your ability to decide who your character is. I've talked about this elsewhere before, and I'll be talking about it again eventually, but it's worth discussing here as well, because it's an issue for this game. The character generation and tutorial sequence goes so far to explain every detail about your character's life by the time you leave the vault. The only real choice you have with your character is limited to their own morality, whether you're good, evil, or neutral. Everything else is totally superficial. The game starts with your birth, and the first character you see is your father, and within a few short seconds you learn that your mother has died. Through the rest of the tutorial sequence, you see your character take their first baby steps, you see your 10th birthday and learn that you get your first job the following day. You learn who your best friend is. You learn who your bullies are. You learn who your dad's friends are. You get a lifetime job assigned to you, and you learn that you're 19 years old by the time the game properly starts. None of these aspects can be changed in any way. Even if you decide to treat your friend like shit and try to side with the bullies, what little option there is to do so, the game gives absolutely no feedback on it because these aspects are written in stone. Before the game has even started, your entire backstory has been written out for you, with absolutely zero ability to change any aspect of it in any way, shape, or form. This isn't a game series that is all about choice and deciding who you are. While Fallout 1 and 2 did have some limitations in terms of backstory, they still allowed more freedom than this. New Vegas handled this best, as the only aspect set in stone about your character is the fact they were working as a courier when they got shot in the head by Benny. All other history and personality are entirely free for the player to decide. The baffling part about this is that Bethesda routinely gives a player a blank slate character in their Elder Scrolls games all the time. The only detail about your character in the Elder Scrolls games, besides maybe being a prophesized chosen one, is the fact you start off as a prisoner. No other details about who you are exist. so it's strange they forego that here for no good reason. It's also really weird for them to try and write a character for you, yet still treat you as though you're a total blank slate like in their other games. I'd honestly have less issue with this if they had committed fully to writing a character for you that you play as. The way it's handled here is basically throwing a backstory onto a blank slate character and largely acting as though that backstory doesn't exist. If there's such an emphasis on the player character's backstory, it should have been better developed. It should be an integral part of who they are, and it should help inform their decisions later on. Either commit fully or don't do it at all, because this half-assed in-between is not a best-of-both-worlds situation. I am jumping ahead of myself a bit here, but I felt this was something that should be discussed early on. The character's birth sequence is followed up 1 year later as they take their first baby steps, which again seems like a really strange choice. I suppose there's nothing wrong with it, but I feel like what you do in this segment could have been done elsewhere and in such a way that would provide better development for the characters within the vault, and especially for your character's father, who we're supposed to care about as the entire main story is about him and what he wants. This ironically foreshadows how infantile Bethesda will treat their audience in the decade following this game's release. In the previous games when you started, you were given a simple screen allowing you to choose all available statistical information about your character. Tag skills, traits, male or female, character name, and special. Even in Morrowind and Oblivion, character generation was fairly straightforward. For some reason in Fallout 3, they decided to stretch the character generation out as far as possible, with each aspect given its own segment, though some have been removed as well. During the birth sequence, you pick your name and character appearance. In the baby sequence, you pick your special, and in the goat exam sequence, you pick your tag skills. Traits have been removed for no discernible reason, and it's part of a trend on Bethesda's part of removing RPG mechanics that existed in previous entries, even though they didn't have a hand in previous Fallout games. After allocating your special points, your father returns and literally explains the entire point of the story to you. Water is important to life existing. This point ends up actually being hilariously ironic due to the sheer incompetence of the world design, but that's an issue I'll cover later on when it's more relevant. This segment transitions to your 10th birthday, where very little of any significance happens. Your friend Amada gives you a skill book as a present, which gives you a skill point in melee combat, and already I'm going to tie this back to character generation being tied to a single screen like in the previous games. The skill book Amada gives you is always the same every single time. What might have been a bit more interesting would be if it had instead been based on your tag skills, complete with accompanying dialogue. It would have to be based randomly on which of your 3 tag skills it gives a book based on, but would be a nice way early on to acknowledge your character build in some way. For example, if you pick science as one of your tag skills, Amada can instead give you a big book of science, and she can maybe comment on the fact that your character is a giant fucking nerd or something. This would be more useful to the player as a skill they intend to use just got a very slight boost in direct reaction for you choosing it, rather than the game giving you a skill book for a skill that many players are likely to completely ignore and never use. Being given a stat boosting item for a stat the player might not care about in a scripted sequence like this makes no sense in terms of player progression. As far as story goes, it makes sense to get a gift from your friend, but if it was going to be something that could be completely irrelevant to many players, maybe it would have been better to just completely forego the locked-in skill book and instead just have her give your character a baseball or something to that effect, like the other NPCs, which still gets the job done of getting a gift from a friend. The Overseer gives you your Pip-Boy, and you're informed that you will start your first job the following day, which helps set the tone for what life is like in Vault 101 and the personality of the Overseer. He's a no-nonsense and strict leader. Even at a child's birthday party, he can't turn off his official business mode, and only drops the professional act when talking to his daughter. After this, you're given a sweet roll, which Butch tries to immediately steal. You can provoke him into attacking you, which immediately causes a security guard to run to your defense, or you can solve it peacefully, which requires no skill checks of any kind. It's literally just a dialogue option. Now, a tutorial segment of a game should give the player a taste of what the rest of the game will be like. The tutorial is almost like a demo in that sense, and this ends up representing the full-on game fairly well. This is one of the first interactions of the game, and it's already showing us how limited character interaction will be in most scenarios for the rest of the game. Now there are speech checks, but most dialogue options will be rather limited and often meaningless. For example, with Butch here, you have a few options. Some of them result in him giving up, some of them result in him attacking you, and you even have an option to give him the sweet roll. What is the point of adding extra options if they're just going to lead to the same outcome? Wouldn't it have been better to give the player more options that lead to more outcomes? Especially if you take skills into consideration. Similar to Amada's gift, you can end up using a skill in dialogue to change how a situation plays out. Maybe if unarmed combat is a tagged skill, you have the option to threaten Butch instead, in which he realizes he's outmatched. After that, you're sent off to meet Liam Neeson's friend Jonas at the Vault Reactor, and Liam gives you a BB gun. You shoot some targets to kill a rad roach. Jonas takes a picture of you and dear old dad, and the game transitions into the next segment of this introductory sequence, the GOAT test. As mentioned previously, regardless of how you treated Amada and Butch at the birthday party, nothing about them will change in any way by the time you reach this segment. Butch is still a bully who hates you, Amada is still your friend. You do have the choice here to side with the bullies and help them bully her, or you could talk Butch down, or even beat the shit out of him. But again, this choice is entirely meaningless as the game fails to provide any significant feedback on it. It's an encounter that happens, and once it's over, everyone promptly forgets it even happened. Amada will be mad at you if you help the bullies, and they in turn will be cool with you, but only lasts for this one small encounter in this one small segment of the game. By the time the GOAT test segment is over, the entire world just pretends this entire segment didn't even happen, which becomes a bit of a common theme, as most choices will have little to no feedback for your actions. Most choices you have during the tutorial segment of this game are illusions of choice at best. The options are there, but all paths lead to the same destination. Speaking of destination, nothing else of importance happens at the GOAT exam. It's basically a bunch of dumb questions you answer in order to have your tag skills recommended to you. While many of the questions do have direct parallels to skills in-game, it generally seems to be a bit unbalanced, and some answers don't make sense. For example, according to the Fallout Wiki, throwing tea in your granny's face somehow translates to explosives, or saying that you want to catch in baseball translates to big guns, or leaving Mr. Abernathy in his room to rot translates to repair. It seems with the tea and leaving him to rot examples, Bethesda was aiming for more silly options over something that would make sense and clearly indicate to the player which skills are being represented. You can also talk the teacher into just letting you decide your tag skills for yourself. Finally, this leads to the final segment of the introductory sequence. Amada wakes you up and tells you that your father, Liam Neeson, has escaped the vault and now the Overseer's henchmen are after you. Now previously stated, Fallout is a game about choices. It's a core component of the previous two games, and should be here as well, but isn't. The Overseer's henchmen want to kill you. There's no talking them down, there's no surrendering to them, there's no making a deal with them of any kind. They just want to kill you, and your only options in response are to kill them or just run away. A lot of people hate the intro to Fallout 2, but I do like the message it has, that eventually you're going to have to fight someone who can't be reasoned with or talked down. And it's a bit funny that the first true combat encounters of Fallout 3 completely disallow the ability to talk to any of the guards, despite the fact these are people your character grew up with and has known for their entire life. Once again, the tutorial segment should be a preview of what the game proper has to offer, and despite being fairly bad, it's rather accurate to what the overall experience will be like. For some unknown reason, the entire vault is in complete disarray simply because Liam Neeson decided to fuck off out of there. There's a bunch of rad roaches, there's dead civilians. Areas of the vault look like they've been raided. It seems a bit excessive considering what has happened. Hell, we even find out later that some fire started, somehow, which ended up killing some people. It's never explained how or why, and it's never shown in-game. Most of the older generation of Vault 101 would know the vault has opened before. That's how Liam Neeson and the player character got into the vault. But, for whatever reason, the vault was sealed again, and they decided to tell all the children this lie, that the vault has and never will open. So naturally when it does open for Liam Neeson to leave, this is a bit of a shock to the younger characters, but it doesn't explain the level of chaos we see. The birthday party established that rad roaches can get into the vault, but it seemed like a rare thing. Yet during escape there's about a dozen of them. coincidentally at the same time that Liam decided to leave. Due to Liam leaving, the Overseer more or less used the guards as a totalitarian police force to brutally and violently enforce his rule, to the point of seemingly causing all this chaos. They're outright murdering people. Everything is torn apart. It's a complete mess. Why couldn't the Overseer handle everything more rationally? It certainly would have saved lives. Basically, he could have put the vault into lockdown and sort things out at his leisure. Why allow the use of deadly force? Liam is gone. Nothing can be done about that. Question Jonas, arrest Liam's child and bring them in for questioning, and so forth. Also take into consideration that it's incredibly easy for the Overseer to restrict access to the vault door. I'm not sure how he couldn't just cover up the fact that Liam Leeson left, and handle things more discreetly. Instead, he basically does the worst thing possible, which results in at least 5 innocent deaths that we see, as well as more off-screen, and brings the entire vault to the point of civil war. Even if the Overseer is killed, the results of his actions result in Vault 101 descending into chaos for who knows how long before the player finally returns for trouble on the home front. Maybe the Overseer is an incompetent leader, but that's never really fully explored. Also, a small side note, it's amusing that the Overseer's actions have more long-lasting ramifications and consequences than any choice the player has besides poisoning the water at the very end of the game. Though I am getting a bit ahead of myself again here. During your escape, Butch asks you to save his mother. Your options are to save her, let her die, or give Butch your BB gun so he can go save her. The only outcome naturally being that she either dies or doesn't die. This doesn't even affect the possibility for Butch to become a companion later on. So it's basically another illusion of choice. The game goes out of its way to stop you and give you this mini-quest, all for it to be completely irrelevant anyways. Whether she lives or dies doesn't really change anything besides the fact she lives or dies. It's simply a character model that is or isn't loaded into the game during a single quest later on. Moving on, you see more of the chaos mentioned. 2 randos decide to commit suicide by cop, and you eventually find Amada being interrogated by the Overseer. If you let her keep her gun, she'll defend herself from Officer Mack and she will flee. Otherwise, the Overseer will question her in an infinite loop, and Officer Mack will threaten her with being beaten, to which she screeches for them to stop, and the Overseer begins questioning her again. This is the one single point within the introduction where you have a chance to make any kind of change upon the world outside of some character models being loaded into a future scene or not, and that's whether or not you kill the Overseer. This will be discussed more later on when talking about the relevant quest, but if you don't kill the Overseer, he can be talked down and convinced that he is wrong. If you do kill the Overseer, he's replaced by an insufferable asshole who you're required to kill in order to solve the vault's issues. Whichever way you handle it, you eventually reach the vault door and escape. The guards will refuse to cross the vault door into the cave and retreat immediately, and when you're far enough away, they'll close the door behind you, leaving only one way to go, outside into the post-apocalyptic world. Now there's many aspects of the game and world that I want to discuss, such as Megaton having no food source, but I want to try and keep this structured, so I'll be saving those aspects for later once I'm finished discussing the main story. Luckily for all of us, there isn't a whole lot to the main story, so this should go by relatively quickly. For now, we're treated to our first view of the capital wasteland. You're blinded by seeing sunlight for the first time, and you see the destruction upon the land and the ruins of the capital in the distance. It's a fairly good way to introduce the player to the wasteland, if only it wasn't damaged by the overly long and unnecessary introductory sequence. The obvious immediate goal is to find dear old Dad, but now you've got an entire world to explore, and he could be anywhere. But he only left just recently, and likely isn't well equipped, so he can't have gotten too far, right? Well, actually, he manages to traverse the extremely dangerous and mutant-infested DC ruins to reach GNR. He manages to escape the DC ruins to reach Rivet City, and from there he goes to the mutant-infested Project Purity, where he apparently faced no opposition and was perfectly safe. Then he manages to travel across the entire wasteland to reach Vault 112, and he managed to do all of this by the time you've left the vault. You're woken up to find out Liam ran away, but with the way this is set up, it appears as though you were asleep for a couple days, and only then did the Overseer flip shit and send the entire vault into chaos. From the outset, this is pretty ridiculous because Liam has no armor, and only a basic handgun to protect himself from the many dangers he would have encountered. Stranger still is the fact there's no signs of his journey to these locations. Everything is neatly closed, and there's no corpses around anywhere. Enemies are still in locations he would have had to travel through, and so forth. Being that it's an open world game, the issue of him being in Vault 112 immediately upon the player exiting the vault can be easy to miss for the fact he just fucking teleported there, as most players would follow the main beats of the story to reach that point, which would likely take several in-game days, especially if they get sidetracked on Sidequests or trying to make the wasteland a better place. But it's possible to just beeline for Vault 112 and rescue him immediately. Most players won't know this on their first time playing, but it's more of an issue of laziness on Bethesda's part, for not properly accounting for the challenges Liam would have had to have faced on his own journey. The script says he's in Vault 112, so he's there. Just don't think about it too much, okay? Now I realize I did just skip ahead quite a bit, and I do intend on going a bit deeper into the individual quests that led us here, but I felt it necessary to point out that the entire world of Fallout 3, except some character dialogue required for quests, simply does not acknowledge the existence of Liam Neeson's character, and the world of Fallout 3 not properly acknowledging important aspects will become a running theme here. It's also worth pointing out that these quests leading up to this point will make up about half of the main story of this game. It's all about finding Dad with little substance behind it. Starting off from Vault 101, the first destination is Megaton, a city so stupid it will get an entire segment of this video later on. Your goal is to find information on Liam, to find where he went. You are directed to Moriarty's saloon, as James sought information there himself. Also, everyone in the town will send the player there. For some strange reason, Moriarty is the one single person who knows where Liam went. Not sure what Liam had to pay for that information with, as Moriarty demands payment from you for info on where Liam went, but again, Bethesda likes to skip details like that. There's a number of ways to get the info from Moriarty. You can pay him for the info. You could do a quest for him to retrieve some money from a runaway hooker. You can steal his terminal password, or use speech to convince a character to give it to you, or use speech to get the info from Moriarty. Either way, there's no impact whatsoever based on these choices. You can kill Moriarty, but the resulting changes to the world are laughable at best. Nova stops officially being a prostitute, but she'll still sleep next to a player in the saloon, and God will paint his own name over Moriarty's on the sign. But he gets no new dialogue to acknowledge the fact that Moriarty is dead, and that's part of a bigger issue that I'll discuss later on. Regardless of how you get the information, the next step in the main story is to reach Galaxy News Radio. This involves doing a dungeon and meeting a shoehorned-in faction that's acting nothing like they should be. The Brotherhood has an outpost at GNR, which is under siege by super mutants, so a strike team has been sent in to kill the mutants and save the outpost. For whatever reason, the Brotherhood, which is typically a strict military-like organization due to their roots being based on a group of former military members from the war, they just allow you to follow them as if it's no big deal, even though they know nothing about you, or that you may pose a risk to their entire operation. A lot of shooting happens and you're given a Fat Man, the most powerful weapon in the game, and this is still only the first quest in the main story. Now the time it takes to reach a Fat Man is longer than it is to reach the power armor in Fallout 4, so this is only slightly less egregious, but it still shows a marked difference in their game design philosophy. Back in Morrowind, you could get super powerful gear early on, but you had to know where to look, and there are often challenges to reach them. You didn't just get them in the first few quests of the game. In Oblivion, they went overboard on curating the experience by having everything be leveled, and anytime loot couldn't be locked behind a leveled list, the devs just put in the lowest quality equipment into just about every dungeon. That's why you always see iron swords lying on tables and in weapon racks in dungeons at level 50. For some reason in Fallout 3, they just decide to hand the players the most powerful non-unique weapon in the first quest of the game. It's limited by its ammo type being somewhat rare, but it's not rare to the point of it being a hindrance. Anyways, you reach GNR and Three Dog, the radio host of the capital wasteland. Now you can meet him for the first time after doing all the other quests in the game, and regardless of whether you're a paragon of virtue or scum of the earth, he won't comment on that fact to your face. He'll treat you exactly the same in direct conversation, regardless of what your karma is, which is quite strange considering how outward he is about praising or criticizing you on his radio show. In fact, it seems downright inconsistent that they treat you neutrally in person. It's almost as though NPC 3Dog and Radio 3Dog are two completely different people. He talks about the good fight, which is essentially just doing good things to make the world a better place, and causing trouble for the various evildoers of the wasteland. However, once again, this is never followed up on or expanded upon. I'm sure you're already noticing how fast that issue is building up. Anyways, 3Dog's way of fighting the good fight is with his radio broadcasts, reporting the news and praising the good people of the wasteland while deriding the horrible people of the wasteland. By which I mean the player, because that's all he ever fucking talks about to the point of it being creepy and weird. More on that later. He says he knows where Liam went, but first he wants you to do a job for him. You could skip it with a speech check, or you can just accept his job. This starts the optional Galaxy News radio quest, the goal of which is to loot a quest item from a dungeon and install it in the Washington Monument to revive his radio signal. And that's it, that's the entire quest. 3Dog tells you that Liam went to Rivet City. You go to Rivet City and talk to Dr. Lee. She tells you he went to Project Purity at the old Jefferson Memorial. There you find a holotape sending you to Vault 112. I'm seriously not even skipping out on detail here. These are the quest objectives as they're presented in-game. At Vault 112 you discover this vault experiment is a simulation, which you enter in order to save Liam. As it turns out, the man in control of this simulation is a complete fucking mustache-twirling cartoon villain who gets off on the suffering and pain of others, and for some reason he's taken on the appearance of a young girl. You can either use the failsafe to have all the residents killed permanently, thus putting them out of their eternal suffering, and leaving Braun to himself forever isolated in the simulation, or you could do his dirty work for him and cause pain and suffering towards residents before finally killing them all for Braun. Though this death is only temporary for them, it's something they've got to deal with over and over and over for all eternity. For whatever reason, Braun can't control the player, and once the player has done all of his tasks, he'll just let both the player and Liam go. Braun also gave Liam all the information he needed as well, for some reason, which makes little sense to me. Considering the fact Braun is a through-and-through psychopath who actively enjoys the suffering of others, it comes off as a bit strange that he would just give Liam all the info he needs all willy-nilly, without asking for anything in return. And not only that, but giving Liam the correct information, and not just intentionally misleading him for shits and giggles. And only when Liam decided to leave, does Braun decide to ask him to start tormenting people. And when Liam refuses, he gets turned into a dog. It's also a bit strange that both the player and Liam are excluded from the failsafe, but logic certainly isn't this game's strongest aspect. Liam returns to Rivet City, and recruits a gaggle of morons to Project Purity. If you haven't cleared it out yet, your first task is to exterminate everything living inside. Then you're directed to do a few menial tasks, replacing some fuses, starting up the mainframe, and draining some pipes. During these tasks, Liam will either tell you he's proud of you if you deactivated the megaton bomb, or disappointed if you blew it up. It's quite strange that he isn't far more horrified by the prospect that his child killed all those people and nuked a town. That's probably the single most extreme action someone could possibly take. And Liam's reaction is mild disappointment. Anyways, the Enclave shows up and starts wrecking shit for no reason. They just show up like some mobsters who haven't been paid protection money and demand control over the place. By default, the Enclave troops are all hostile to you, yet they're initially neutral to everyone else. Shouldn't they be trying to capture you? Or are they just hostile because they read the script and found out you're the player character? Project Purity was started well over 20 years ago, and not once in all that time did the Enclave take any interest in it. Only 5 entire minutes after Project Purity is restaffed and work has started again, does the Enclave take interest and show up and demand control. Much of the groundwork was there and uncontested for 2 decades, but only now do they care. So Colonel Autumn, rather than trying to negotiate or listen to reason, instead acts like a total fucking gormless mong, murders a random woman to show he means business, and makes the entire situation worse, because apparently he spends all his free time getting into headbutting matches with a fucking bowling ball. He demands control of the Purifier, even though it has never worked, and has only ever been theoretical, and he changes his demands to instead have Liam turn over all information on the project, even though he should be able to access that information already, and requiring the Project Purity scientists to assist in getting it operational, even though his own scientists are likely far more knowledgeable than the bunch of rando wastelanders. This is also despite the fact that the scientists have only been here and working on it for about 10 minutes, and they haven't gotten anything of any significance completed. They only just started working on the project again. Information regarding the project turns out to be entirely irrelevant anyways, because he doesn't actually get anything in the scene, and by the end of the game, all the Enclave needs is the password to activate the purifier, which they could have eventually brute forced if it wasn't for terrible writing. More on that a little later. Or they could have just tried hacking the system. This also plants Colonel Autumn firmly in the territory of brain-dead fucking villains who do stupid shit for no reason. I can understand the perspective that he wants control of the purifier. Almost any group would logically want to control such an insanely valuable resource in the post-apocalypse. But he comes in, starts murdering people, and won't even listen to the extremely basic logic that the project was only theoretical and never actually functioned properly. And he does all this for information and help that he doesn't actually need. If he was smart, he would have done one of the following. A. Take everyone prisoner immediately. Force those who are skilled to work on the project. B. Approach the situation diplomatically and try to work out a deal. C. Have everyone killed on the spot. D. Tell them they're trespassing on government property, but he'll let them live if they all leave right fucking now. Because here's the situation we're left with. The Enclave clearly wants the purifier for some reason. If they have the right scientists for the job already, it becomes a question of why didn't they do this before? If they don't have the scientists, and they require the help of Liam Neeson and Dr. Lee, then they should have either approached this more diplomatically, in a I'll make you an offer you can't refuse type deal, or just arrest everyone, sort shit out, and have the prisoners you need do the work you need, with the remaining prisoners being used as hostages. As it turns out, the Enclave does get the purifier set up perfectly all on their own by the end of the game, so clearly they didn't need Liam and Dr. Lee, which leaves options C and D. It seems as though this scene exists purely for forced drama followed by an action scene, but luckily for everyone, Liam is a smart and logical individual, so he naturally turns over all the information on the project and seeks a way to bargain out of this, so you can regroup later and figure out a way to counter the Enclave. Oh wait, no, he fucking blows it up instead, and somehow manages to release lethal levels of radiation, killing everyone in the room who doesn't have a plot device on them. What the fuck, man? Okay, hold the fuck on. Before anything else, where the fuck did that radiation come from? This is a computer terminal, and they hadn't purified any water yet, so no radiation had been removed from the water, so where did it come from? At least I'm assuming that's how it works, but if not, then it's a moot point. How the fuck did this terminal release lethal levels of radiation? How did Liam know this terminal would kill everyone in the room? Why does it have this insane design flaw to explode if you put in the wrong code? But besides that, Autumn had demanded that Liam Neeson and his team work with the Enclave to make Project Purity operational. Surely he could have made some kind of deal or work with them temporarily with the intent to subvert them somehow or something. Why is suicide for no good reason the default option here? It was quite clear that Autumn wasn't going to leave, so why escalate the situation when the reasoning didn't work on Autumn the first time? If anything, working with the Enclave would have been an advantage in the short term, because with the combined forces of Liam and his crew working with the Enclave scientists, they might have been able to get it working. Not to mention recovering the Gek from Vault 87, and Liam could have sent his child off to get help from the Brotherhood or something. Also, why is Autumn so adamant about having them turn over information related to the project? Just tell them to fuck off and be glad they're allowed to leave with their lives. It feels like Bethesda wanted a tense moment and ran out of Liam Neeson budget, so they wrote him out of the story, but didn't think through how fucking dumb this scenario is. There's an old 4chan post I've referenced before, and I'll reference again through this video that accurately describes this entire situation. Dad killed himself rather than let his broken machine fall into the hands of people trying to fix it. As a result, a water purifier that has no reason to exist released radiation it shouldn't have, thus killing Colonel Autumn, who had no reason to be there. So I've got to ask, were we supposed to care about Liam Neeson as a character? because they don't really do a whole lot with him in order to endear the player to him or to get people attached to him as a character. They pulled this shit in Fallout 4 as well, where your significant other dies an entire 5 minutes into the game, and it's treated as though you're supposed to care, but they don't do anything to build that connection. With James here, there's a couple small segments in the vault, then what little time you have between rescuing him in Vault 112 and the time he dies here. He comes across less as a character and more like a plot device trying to keep the story going. I honestly can't say a whole lot on this topic because Bethesda didn't give me much to work with on this topic. I don't see why James couldn't have instead been a regular character in the world, instead of the player's father specifically. The act of making him related to you implies there's supposed to be some connection or a reason for the player to care, but they don't really do that. At least they don't do it very well. Many other games and movies can get the audience attached to a character, if they're written well enough, and if the audience spends enough time with them. But Bethesda does neither here. They've never really been strong character writers, as their stories are generally more world-focused, and characters weren't fleshed out that well. I'm not sure I can blame this one on laziness, but it's certainly a fault of the game and the writers, that they didn't do a whole lot to get the audience to care about James as a character. I mean, sure, some people will care about him. Some people could get invested rather easily, but overall I just don't see why he absolutely had to be related to the player if they weren't going to do anything of significance with him. There's also games that are about characters seeking revenge for family being murdered, but the difference is you're playing as an established character with a backstory. You caring about Max Payne's wife dying is less important than it being a personal goal for him to get revenge. But Fallout 3 places you in the shoes of a character who is largely a blank slate. The Lone Wanderer doesn't have a personality or a story written in stone, besides the entire intro and prior to Broken Steel, the ending. But otherwise, you make the choices, you make the character, or you could self-insert. Games like this can make you care about characters in the world, but Bethesda instead gives you a character, tells you he's your father, and just expects you to care when he dies after about 15 to 20 minutes of interaction with them. Anyways, back to the events at hand. James just fucking necked himself via a violently exploding computer terminal. The writers seem to think shoving poorly written bullshit into their games is perfectly fine if you immediately follow it with an action scene so the players don't have much time to think about the sheer fucking stupidity that just occurred. Before you even have a chance to do anything, Dr. Lee starts screeching in your face about escaping, and you're chased through tunnels that conveniently lead directly to the Citadel, the Brotherhood's stronghold. Along the way, in an attempt to make the situation more tense, one of the cardboard cutouts that is very generously called to character starts to have a heart attack, and he needs a few stim packs to survive. You can find some in the dungeon, or you can actually just fucking leave the entire dungeon, walk all the way to Rivet City, or Megaton, or Tenpenny Tower, or Paradise Falls, and purchase some stim packs and walk all the way back and save him. Or alternatively, you could just convince Dr. Lee to leave him, in which case he dies. Or you can blow him to bits right in front of Dr. Lee's stupid fucking face. Regardless, all that's at stake is a character that has no use to the story and doesn't ever do anything, isn't ever mentioned outside the specific situation, serves no purpose for existing, and is just completely irrelevant in every possible way. Moving on, we reach the Citadel. Dr. Lee demands entrance, and that's all it takes. We're in. We learn a Gek is needed for Project Purity, but one of the Brotherhood's top scribes outright blatantly says there's some doubt that Geks even exist. Just as a reminder for everyone, Vault City existed prior to the start of Fallout 2, and by the end of that game, Arroyo is saved and turned into a major city with the use of another Gek. And there's absolutely no way in hell the Brotherhood is not aware of these two locations that have factually used the Gek. I know it's a point I hammer on a lot, but I feel like this is a fucking key piece of evidence here that Bethesda doesn't know what the fuck they're doing, or they just don't care. The primary goal of the entire previous game was to acquire a Gek to save your village, which you end up doing and succeeding, and yet they just have one of the top Brotherhood scribes cast doubt on the existence of a Gek for no fucking reason. Anyways, you're directed to a terminal that lists the vaults in the Capital Wasteland, and you determine there's one in Vault 87. You're told the entrance was directly hit by a nuke, so the radiation there is way worse than anywhere else in the game, including Megaton if you blow it up, and including the White House, which was also a direct hit. Don't fucking question it, alright? Bethesda are masters of consistency, and this totally isn't contrived bullshit to force you through one of the dumbest segments in video game history. Due to the main entrance being inaccessible, you have to go through the back entrance in Lamplight Caverns. This leads you to a village consisting entirely of children. The entire gimmick here is that children hate adults and exile people once they reach adulthood on their birthdays. Remember how I said it would become a running theme that the world of Fallout 3 fails to acknowledge or explain crucial details about how it functions on a fundamental level? Yeah, this is another one to add to the list. But I'm sure many people watching this video will have noticed this trend by now. Once again, it's something to be discussed later. What won't be discussed later is the fact that Lamplight limits your choice in handling the situation. Up until this point, there's been some level of freedom dealing with NPC encounters. Most have been a bit lacking from what should be available in a Fallout game, but it was somewhat tolerable. This isn't. In Lamplight, the game outright takes away your ability to engage in combat, to the point you're not even allowed to draw your weapon initially. This is largely due to the fact that children cannot be killed in this game. While you can attack children in other areas of the game, it's completely disallowed when you first reach Lamplight. This is likely due to the fact that it might be possible to soft lock the game, as attacking McCready might cause him to leave his post, which would make it impossible to engage in dialogue with him again, which would prevent you from progressing in the main story. Lamplight is arguably a failure on nearly every core aspect of designing a Fallout game and writing a story. The game gives an explanation for why children originally lived in Lamplight, but that was 200 years ago, and there's no reasoning given for why children still live here. I'm not sure if the folks at Bethesda are aware of this fact or not, but people age, even children. The only reason they created this location was to have yet another dumb gimmicky set piece. As for the choice aspect, I can't help but question why Bethesda would design a segment in their game that specifically goes out of its way to remove choice, when one of the core aspects of that game is choice. Now, I understand the fact that children being killed in the game would upset some people, and the Pearl Clutchers of the world would cry and try to get the game banned, but that only raises the question of why design it in this way. I could maybe understand if they had an interesting story to tell with Little Lamplight, but they don't even do that. What's the backstory? There's a field trip on a Saturday to the caverns. The teachers, guides, and children were in the caverns when the bombs dropped. The adults went out looking for supplies one by one and never came back. They likely all died. So all the children started hating adults for abandoning them, which has been passed down for 200 entire years. That's it. That's the story of Lamplight with no further depth or elaboration. It comes across as though some fucknut suggested a town full of kids because that's wacky and weird, and that makes total sense for Fallout because Fallout 2 was wacky and weird. You have absolutely no choice but to get help from the children, through doing a speech check, by using a particular perk, or by doing a quest for them. There's no alternatives. You have to gain the favor of these dumb children who shouldn't fucking exist. You can't threaten, you can't destroy their barrier, you can't scare them. Any and all hostile action is removed from the player. There isn't even an alternative route around having to deal with Lamplight at all. It's either deal with this dumb fucking scenario or fuck you, you're not progressing in the main story. Bethesda could have designed this whole section of the game differently to allow more choice or to give players an alternate path. If killing kids in a game is so controversial, maybe put the town full of kids elsewhere so as not to intrude on the main story and be forced to deal with them. Or hey, better yet, maybe not design this stupid fucking bullshit in the first place because it makes no goddamn sense. Now, as we'll learn in a few short minutes, Vault 87 is actually where the super mutants originate from in the Capital Wasteland. Yet the front entrance to Lamplight is a wooden barricade. Now obviously it can't be destroyed due to the way games work, they're static objects and don't have destruction physics. But from a story point of view, what has stopped the super mutants from blowing the fuck out of it and storming Lamplight? Well, maybe they just never explored the pre-war tourist attraction. I'm not sure why, but hey, I suppose it's possible, right? Well, actually, it doesn't fucking matter, because they have the same barricade at the back entrance to the vault. The super mutants have been a plague upon the capital wasteland for years. They kidnap people to eat or turn into more super mutants. They infest the DC ruins and many other locations. Yet when it comes to these children and Lamplight, they're just completely incapable of taking down a simple wooden barricade. Don't think about it. Remember, asking questions is bad. Just accept what you're given and you fucking enjoy it, scum! As mentioned, Vault 87 is the source of the super mutants in this game. For whatever reason, their Vault experiment was testing a separate strain of FEV on the residents. At some point, their mutated test subjects escaped, took control of the Vault, and proceeded to convert everyone else into super mutants. Because this strain of FEV was bad, it resulted in all the super mutants being incredibly dumb and aggressive, with few incredibly rare exceptions that are treated like special cases. The discussion of super mutants being in this game will have to wait for a bit later, however. For now, proceeding through the vault, we'll eventually meet Fox, a super mutant who isn't an orc in an eternal blood rage. He will help you acquire the Gek if you free him, but you can also just go do it yourself if you have enough Radaway. As you attempt to leave, you'll be knocked out by a magic grenade. No matter how far you run and no matter what equipment you've got on, you're captured by the Enclave and taken to their secret base. That's probably record time for a plot device being obtained and made completely irrelevant to the story. That's right, that's the last we'll ever see of the Gek, and it might only be mentioned one or two more times, if that. So you wake up as a prisoner in the Enclave base, and Colonel Clink starts questioning you. He demands the password for the purifier that doesn't work. You could give him the password, but this results in him immediately killing you. For no reason. At this point, the only thing you've personally done against the Enclave is kill some of their troops that were already trying to kill you. Keep in mind, they were not trying to capture you at Project Purity, they were outright trying to murder you, including when you try to escape with Dr. Lee. The worst thing you've personally done towards the Enclave at this point is pure self-defense. Because Autumn is a brain-dead moron who is a poorly written villain who can only solve things with violence. This is what I mean when I say it feels like the game is trying to bluntly tell you he's a bad guy because he's evil, rather than showing him doing questionable and immoral things, yet with clear motivation. He's instead a completely over-the-top mustache-twirling villain, to the point I'm surprised he isn't wearing a fucking sandwich board with the phrase, "I'm an evil bad guy" on it. We still don't even know what his fucking motivation even is at this point, just that he wants the purifier. This is only our second encounter with him, so maybe there's some time to build this up more. I mean, we can't be that far into the main story, right? Nope, joke's on you, fucknut. This is the second last quest of the main story, and there's only one more encounter with Autumn. His entire motivation for wanting the purifier is completely unknown and unexplained until the last couple minutes of the game, and even then it can be missed extremely easily. Most people who have only played through this game once, and hell, probably even many people who've played through this game numerous times, don't even fucking know what his motivations are, because they're never properly explained or explored. Autumn shows up, wrecks shit, murders indiscriminately, demands control, and is apparently killed but gets saved by a magic plot device that's never explained, shows up again, demands info, and tries to kill you, all without the slightest hint of what the fuck he's even doing any of this for. There's poorly written Saturday morning cartoon villains that are more well developed than Colonel fucking Autumn. He doesn't exist to explore the vices or virtues of man, he doesn't show us anything about how the world works, he isn't a representation of strength or greed or brutality or dishonesty. He doesn't grow or change, he doesn't learn anything, he doesn't have any goals or desires, and worst of all, he's got no personality. No, an accent isn't a personality. Autumn exists to be an antagonist because the game needed one. His troops exist to be an enemy force, to be a threat, because the game needed opposition to the player. The Enclave and Fallout 3 don't fucking do anything, and they don't fucking stand for anything. The game tells you they want to bring America back to how it was before the war, to restore the country. But what the fuck does that even mean? It ends up being an entirely meaningless platitude, a vague nothingness with zero value. They've had countless years to do literally anything to try to restore the wasteland, and they've done jack and shit. They could have very easily been built up to be a faction with support from some wastelanders, for trying to rebuild society to a degree. Have it be a gated community they're in charge of. Give them loyal supporters and even enemies. But instead, all they did was release a bunch of fucking iBots into the wasteland and expect people to support them through that alone. Which is also weird when you consider Eden wants to straight up murder them all. Which makes the iBots spewing propaganda a huge and unnecessary waste of resource. If you deny telling the password to Autumn, which is the only way to progress at this point in the game, President Eden suddenly wants to talk to you in person. It's worth noting that if you give Autumn the wrong password for the purifier, he'll call up some of his men stationed there and have them input it, and he'll be told that they lost another man. As in, each time you enter the wrong code, the terminal fucking explodes and someone dies. What the fuck is this thing made of? This is a convenient and lazy way to handwave the fact they can't just brute force the password, which is fucking stupid. So you're telling me putting in the wrong code causes the computer to explode violently enough to kill someone, but not enough to destroy the terminal that's fucking exploding? Fucking what, mate? Don't give me any shit about radiation either, because as we've already seen, the Enclave has a perfect immunity serum for it. It saved Autumn earlier, and I have to assume Autumn and his troops used it to get in and out of Vault 87, and they would have needed an extra dose to use on the player as well, while they're pulling them out of there. So defending this by saying the chamber is still irradiated is complete bullshit, but Bethesda constantly contradicting themselves has become something of a common theme. Once you're released, Autumn turns the entire base into a dungeon full of enemies, at which point Eden starts murdering his own men in cold blood, just so you can reach him. When you eventually do get to talk to him, he tells you he wants to wipe out all the surface dwellers because they're tainted by mutation, and his modified FEV will destroy him, and he specifically wants you to do this, because Autumn has betrayed him and disagrees with the FEV plan. See, this is why character motivation matters, because now the player has no idea what the fuck is going on, and this is about to get a whole lot messier. Autumn is second in command of the Enclave, and he just openly turned against Eden with full support of his troops. But this whole scenario makes no fucking sense in the slightest. Eden wants to talk to you before Autumn rebels against him, so Autumn's betrayal can't have been the reason Eden wanted to talk to you, which only leaves the modified FEV, in which case why the fuck would he even think for a fraction of a second that some rando vault dweller who until recently hasn't had to deal with combat would stand any kind of chance against an organized military force alone. Sure, there's the Brotherhood, but he doesn't know if they'll rally to fight Autumn's Enclave, and he doesn't even know if they'll win. They only do so by pure miracle and luck of getting Liberty Prime operational. Otherwise they'd be completely outmanned, outgunned, and outmatched. And what would have happened if Autumn just begrudgingly followed orders? Like, he doesn't want to kill the citizens of the wasteland, but he'd just let you do it because the president asked you to? No, really, what the fuck was Eden's plan if Autumn didn't betray him? This entire fucking plan is stupid and makes no sense at all, but it gets even worse. You can actually convince Eden to kill himself and the Enclave. I thought this guy was supposed to be a super advanced and super intelligent computer. Let's do some basic math here. He wants you to put the modified FEV into the purifier, which will kill all the impure people and creatures living on the surface. This is so that pure humans can repopulate and rebuild the country. Except he destroys his own forces, which are mostly pure humans. As far as we know from info provided in Fallout 3, that only leaves the Vault 101 residents in the Capital Wasteland, which are said to only be viable for reproduction for a couple more generations. Also, if everything is fucking dead, then what are they going to eat? If the modified FEV destroys everything that's mutated, and since everything is mutated, that means all life on the surface is done for, so it's not like they can grow crops or anything like that. In fact, they don't even have a Gek, so they're completely fucked out of luck, and the only Gek in a 100-mile radius was just wasted on a water purifier, so it's not like they can even have their own Fallout 2 quest here. This entire story is a fucking abortion of logic and common sense. Everything just happens because the plot needs it to happen, or because some fucknut had a wacky idea for a set piece and wanted to put it into the game, regardless of how fucking stupid it was. Oh, you can also defeat Eden if you throw a simple logic paradox at him. That's right, the main villain of Fallout 3, a super advanced AI, can basically be killed by saying, "This sentence is false." Blowing up Eden is totally optional though. So you leave the secret Enclave base and return to the Brotherhood. They pull out Liberty Prime and you go on a death march to the Purifier with them, and a squad of Brotherhood troops. You don't even have to do anything, they just kill all the enemies for you. In fact, it's more of a challenge to try and get a shot on one of the enemies. Liberty Prime kicks the Enclave shit in without effort, and you reach the Purifier to confront the final boss of the game, Colonel Autumn. Of all the main Fallout games, this is by far the most underwhelming final boss encounter. Fallout 1 had the Master, one of the deepest and most well-developed characters with one of the strongest personalities in the entire series. He was a tough boss fight, but you could have the more satisfying option of talking him down. Fallout 2 had Frank Horrigan, this brutal and unstoppable force. New Vegas had their own Frank Horrigan in the form of Lanius, this brutal and merciless warlord. Fallout 4 didn't have a final boss, but that game was complete fucking dogshit anyways. Fallout 3 has Colonel Autumn, who is an underwhelming boss fight and represents nothing but a bad guy that needs to be killed because he's a bad guy. You can learn his true plans. He wants to use the Purifier so the Enclave will be seen as heroes to the people of the Capital Wasteland, to build support for the Enclave. That's it. That's its goal. That's what all this bullshit was about. So instead of negotiating and trying to build a better reputation for the Enclave through their actions, he instead acts like a brain-dead goon and throws his military might around at the drop of a hat and terrorizes everyone, all in order to get control of the Purifier. The most hilarious part about this is the fact that if Autumn won, the result likely wouldn't be that bad for the Wasteland. Based on what little we know of him, Autumn is actually against Eden's plan for genocide. He still considers the people of the Wasteland to be American citizens, and he seems to truly want to rebuild the country. If you talk him down, he's written out of the game. That's it, he just leaves with nowhere to go and nothing to do. Even if you have broken steel, he doesn't appear, so he just vanishes forever for some reason. And that's what's frustrating about these big bad guys. Horrigan was a total zealot to the Enclave. He believed their goals and purpose so much that nothing could talk him down, and that's fine. The Master realized his error and was horrified at all the lives his plan had cost and destroyed. It's satisfying talking him down because he sees the error of his way and the destruction he's personally directly responsible for. Lanius, however, cannot be convinced that he's wrong. He's only in it for Caesar. But he's still this deadly and imposing force, and you can convince him to wait until his forces are stronger. You're not stopping him, you're delaying him, and he will eventually come, and when he does, he will be a force to be reckoned with. The might of Lanius coming down upon the Mojave is inevitable. When it comes to Eden and Autumn, you're not convincing them of anything, you aren't changing their perspective or proving to them that they're wrong, you're not delaying an unstoppable force for an eventual and inevitable battle that will likely be a bloodbath. You just kind of tell them they're wrong, and they're like, oh, okay. Which results in Autumn just walking away with absolutely nowhere to go, and nothing to do, and Eden just fucking nicks himself at the drop of a hat. If Autumn showed up in Broken Steel, you would probably find him on the Enclave mobile base, and he would say, "You again?" After dealing with Autumn, apparently the equipment for the Purifier was damaged or something, and is about to go critical and explode. Apparently from some pressure buildup or something, but even then that makes no fucking sense, because the Purifier hasn't been activated. This fucking thing sat here for 20 years with no pressure buildup. Liam Neeson didn't get it running in the 10 minutes he had control of it, and the Enclave couldn't get it running. That's why you were captured, for the code to start it. So how the fuck did pressure build up to catastrophic levels to the point the entire fucking facility will explode if you don't immediately activate it? You can let it explode, or you could put in the code and start the Purifier. Or you could get Sarah Lyons to do it for you. It's really lucky that the Enclave took the GEC and somehow applied it to the equipment to make it work. But unfortunately, there's lethal levels of radiation in there still, somehow, which means whoever goes in there is going to die. There are 3 potential companions who could go in and safely turn it off. Fox, who is immune, Charon, who is a ghoul and therefore healed by radiation, and Sergeant RL3, a robot. They all tell you to go fuck yourself for absolutely no reason, so it's still either you or Sarah Lyons. You have the option to put the modified FEV into the purifier, which will result in bad karma. But if you don't, you get good karma. Then you put in the password, and the game automatically ends, and you die. In previous Fallout games, the ending is accompanied by a slideshow detailing your actions and involvement with different characters and factions throughout the wasteland. How you helped them or what damage you caused them. If you saved them or killed them or let them die out. Fallout 3 does not have that. Instead, it has a rather generic slideshow based on karma. There's an ending for good, neutral, and evil karma characters. Some slides will show up based on decisions you made in Sidequests, but there's no narration for them at all. It's just an image with no additional audio. The only choice that's ever acknowledged through the narration, besides karma, is if you decide to poison the water or not. And that's it. That's the game. That's Fallout 3. It's fucking over now. I first played this game when I was in high school, and I wasn't really critical of the media I consumed back then. But looking back, I don't know how I got taken in by this shit. I don't understand how anyone got taken in by this shit. This story is Barebones. Find Dad, fix water purifier. They don't even explore any concepts about humanity or survival in the wasteland, or anything of the sort. The entire lack of water issue is barely even explored. Like, the game starts off with Liam Neeson literally telling us how fucking important water is, and the reason Project Purity is so goddamn important to him is because of the people suffering in the wasteland. He's just doing this for purely altruistic reasons. Yet, the wasteland doesn't really seem like it's any worse off than what it might have been 20 years ago when he abandoned the project. The issue of people dying of thirst is barely portrayed. The most we get are the 3 water beggars when dehydration or lack of clean drinking water should be endemic across the wasteland. Drinking water should be the absolute #1 concern of just about every character and group in the world, and it should be a daily struggle for survival. Yet, that's contrasted by a constant overflow of dumb bullshit like cosplayers fighting in the street, or a Nuka-Cola obsessed cartoon character, or the upper-class snobs of Tenpenny Tower, or this dipshit's love pad right next to a raider base. You could find a random encounter of people fighting over some purified water, but when it actually comes down to portraying this dire need in static locations and situations, it's barely touched upon and might as well not even exist. Seriously, remove Liam Neeson and the 3 water beggars from the game, and what is there in the world to tell you that a lack of clean drinking water is an issue for anyone? In a story all about a dire lack of drinkable water, it seems to be the least concern anyone has in the world besides Liam Neeson, who gets written out of the game 10 minutes after you rescue him from Vault 112. Fallout 1 barely mentioned the water issue too, but it was mostly localized to Vault 13, not the entire game world. And even then you'd get reminders that the vault was running out of water. The only other major example was Necropolis, which would die out if you didn't fix their water pump. Fallout 3 tells us that clean drinking water is the most important thing ever, and promptly forgets about it. The only reason it's important is because we're told it is, and it's Liam Neeson's one desire, to the point it's a fault of the character. But we're barely ever shown how important it is to the world at large. No one in Paradise Falls has any concern about water. Nor Arafu, Republic of Dave, Big Town, Little Lamplight, or anywhere else. How about that well-developed antagonist faction? The entire villain faction amounts to little more than baddies to exist because the game needs some baddies. Remember the Enclave in Fallout 2? They're portrayed as a force you don't want to trifle with. You repeatedly see Frank Horrigan wrecking people's shit with extreme ease, and they have a huge intimidation factor. They've got a sinister armor design. Frank Horrigan himself was a hulking monstrosity in power armor. They're a highly organized and aggressive military, and have no one to oppose them in force. The Brotherhood was falling apart and barely had a presence. The NCR hadn't expanded enough to have a standing army, and everywhere else was loose settlements of people trying to get by in one way or another. Black Isle Studios put in the effort to establish the Enclave as an unstoppable powerhouse to be feared. Their goals, while not immediately known, are eventually revealed to be a genocidal plot to exterminate those they view as impure, which was all surface dwellers. A human tainted by radiation was no different in their eyes than a super mutant or a ghoul or any of the obviously mutated creatures in the world. And even then, we learn through our adventure that there are good ghouls and super mutants. An entire 36 years later, in Fallout 3, and the Enclave is a caricature of its former self. Their armor looks like bad cosplay. Their leadership is ineffective and stupid. Its leader has the same goals with no growth or development at all. He just wants to poison the water instead of the air. Not a single character in Fallout 3's Enclave has as much presence, personality, or intimidation factor as Frank Horrigan did, and Colonel Autumn ends up feeling like a placeholder for a better antagonist that just never got added to the game. There's certainly potential here for an interesting direction for the Enclave to have gone as a faction, but instead they're just a dumbed-down cartoon version of themselves from before. For whatever reason, Bethesda just decides to never explore what Autumn's goals or motivations were, when it's something that could have easily led to a new iteration of the Enclave existing as they grow and evolve as a faction, either for better or worse. President Eden feels like a dollar store Chinese knockoff of the Master from Fallout 1. Both are immobile beings of immense intelligence that command great armies, are charismatic, and have a plan for the future. But the Master ultimately had more personality and was better developed. You can hear the emotion in his voice, and from this one single encounter you can see how self-righteous he is, the arrogance and confidence in himself. And when you prove his plans wrong, which takes effort to do on the player's part, you can hear the sadness in his voice at the realization that all the atrocities he's committed, all the lives he's ended or ruined, has all been in vain, because his master race can never breed. They'd all die out after a single generation. All this time he had been fighting for progress, to save the world and advance humanity, but his plan never would have succeeded from the outset, and his actions only resulted in making things worse. Eden, on the other hand, can basically be talked down at the drop of a hat. Tell him he's wrong and he'll partly concede and blow himself and the Enclave base up, yet he still expects you to carry out his plan, and there's hardly any emotion in his voice beyond raw confidence that he'll save America with nothing to back it up, even after you've convinced him to kill himself and the Enclave. What about the Brotherhood of Steel? Truly an iconic faction from the original games. They started off as xenophobic technophiles in Fallout 1, but by the time of Fallout 2 it seemed like they were on the brink of destruction. Sure, they likely still occupied Lost Hills and had other outposts, but they weren't doing so well, and their future was unclear. Well, they're back in force on the complete other side of the country, with worse gear than before, and one of their core principles has been thrown into the fucking dumpster, right next to Van Buren, and any chance this game had at being even remotely good. The Brotherhood are now paragons of virtue, who selflessly fight and die for the people of the Wasteland, to the point some of their core members fucked off into the Brotherhood Outcast faction, which is really weird when you consider they uphold the true values of the Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood we interact with in the main story is confirmed to have been cut off by the West Coast Brotherhood for not following their procedures and way of handling things. Their portrayal as flawless knights in shining armor ultimately makes them feel like an equally shallow counterpart to the Enclave being mustache-twirling villains, and in equal similar fashion as to how the game beats you over the head with how evil the Enclave is because they're bad guys, Fallout 3 beats you over the head with the Brotherhood's undying virtue to tell you they're the good guys, because they're good. Their inclusion here doesn't even really make sense either. This next part will be very much reminiscent of Mr. Caption's rant on the Brotherhood in his own video, but I've done my own research here just to confirm the things he said in his own video. After the events of Fallout 2, the NCR and Brotherhood got into a massive war with each other, and while the Brotherhood had the technological advantage, the NCR's sheer numbers were enough to cause serious damage to them, to the point of the Brotherhood retreating and going into hiding. Apparently during this time, they felt the smart thing to do was to send an entire chapter across the entire country to the East Coast. Part of the intent was to re-establish contact with the Midwest Brotherhood, but they were unable to do so. The other part of their objective was to travel to the DC ruins to hoard technology. But the problem with this is the fact that they decided to send this group out there while they were in the middle of a war they were losing. But not only that, they didn't even know if there was actually any technology out there or not. Like, there was a rumor, but we're talking about a country that likely had super advanced technology all over the fucking place. So there logically should be rumors coming out of every part of the country for advanced technology. The problem being you can't necessarily investigate every lead you get. But also, without any evidence, there's no way of knowing if there's actually anything there or not. It's entirely possible that the Brotherhood could have shown up to the capital wasteland to find that it was nuked so hard there was nothing left, and this entire journey would have been in vain. This also isn't even accounting for the certainly perilous journey they'd face traveling across the entire country. There's already plenty of mutated horrors as we see in Fallout 1 and 2. There's no way of knowing if there's anything worse in between California and DC, as they'd be crossing unexplored territory. But that isn't even the end of it. They also set this group up with the inferior T-45 power armor. It just makes no tactical sense to get rid of a large part of your fighting force and send them on what appears to be a suicide mission with unknown dangers and inferior equipment. However, this ends up being a bit of a common theme here, as Elder Lyons decides to wipe out all the raider gangs in the pit during their journey to DC, as if that's something they can just do at the drop of a hat. Then upon reaching the capital wasteland, he made it a goal of his to clean it up from raiders and super mutants as well, which in turn causes the loss of his men, requiring the Brotherhood to recruit random wastelanders, who up until this point they viewed as little more than dirty troglodytes. Their entire mission statement is to keep advanced technology away from the people too stupid to handle it properly. But since he keeps sending his men out to die, they're required to keep recruiting ignorant and inexperienced wastelanders. This is even confirmed by Sarah Lyons in-game, in which she says they have too many local conscripts, most of which are undertrained and too trigger-happy, and she uses Initiate Redden as a prime example. Redden is apparently a random wastelander they decided to take on. She's too excitable, she's stupid, she wastes ammo, and gets killed within minutes of you meeting her. Hilariously enough, despite all her fuck-ups, they actually posthumously promote her to Paladin, even though she did nothing to deserve it. Shit, I guess that everyone's a winner, everyone gets a medal mentality even exists in the post-apocalypse. No, seriously, what the fuck is this hokey, lame-ass feel-good shit? I can imagine honoring someone who fought and died valiantly, or performed some heroic act getting this treatment, but Redden literally just fucking died. Like, does every initiate who dies get the rank of Paladin posthumously? That kind of devalues the rank of Paladin now, doesn't it? Also, considering they purged the pit of most of the raider gangs, why is cleaning up the capital wasteland been so hard? Like, they haven't even taken out Paradise Falls, which is something they should have been able to handle with like 6 or 7 guys. Finally, we have the super mutants, who are all incredibly stupid now and they want to kill anything that moves. Their inclusion in this game is a little more than a lame-ass excuse because Bethesda wanted to have them in this game. There's just a separate strand of FEV because of reasons, and the military decided to share this top-secret weapons project with Vault-Tec because fuck it, I guess. I've made this comparison before, but giving Vault-Tec FEV would be like the equivalent of giving the National Park Rangers a nuke in 1945. In the original games, the super mutants were far more complex than this. They had goals and desires they worked towards, they had personalities. Sure, there were some dumb super mutants, but there were also highly intelligent ones, and they were a formidable and effective force with highly intelligent leaders. Fallout 2 brilliantly followed this up with Marcus and Broken Hills. With the defeat of the Master and the destruction of the FEV vats, their cause was lost, and all that was left for them to do was try to survive, just like everyone else. This resulted in Broken Hills and the conflict that arises based on the prejudice against super mutants, which is the natural progression from the events of the first game. But instead, Bethesda decided the most interesting direction to take them was to turn them into orcs and proceed to do absolutely fucking nothing with them. 3 fucking times in a row. Yeah, the super mutants in Fallout 3 are looking for more FEV, but even that is barely explored at all. They end up just being generic enemies that infest much of the game world with no other purpose. I could have even excused Vault-Tec getting FEV if Bethesda at least had an interesting direction to take the super mutants, or an interesting story to tell with them, but they treat them as little more than just another enemy type. They're raiders, but bigger. Again, this is a point Caption made in his own video, and I feel the need to repeat it here because it's true. You could replace super mutants in Fallout 3, as well as Fallout 4 and 76 for that matter, with anything else, and you wouldn't lose anything from it. Just imagine an entirely new type of creature with a different name and a different reason for existing, besides FEV, but it acts exactly the same as super mutants do in Fallout 3. The difference is, super mutants are a recognizable part of the originals, so I guess Bethesda felt the need to require them, which even then I could excuse if they had followed the lore and kept them accurate to the original games. But I guess they didn't feel like doing that and instead turned them into mindless screeching enemies, And that's exactly why people refer to them as orcs, because that's basically what they've been reduced to here. The only exceptions are Fox and Uncle Leo, both of which are treated as though they're special cases. When it comes down to it, one of the biggest flaws of Fallout 3, besides its piss-poor writing and lack of world building in general, is the obsessive and needless reuse of iconic imagery, factions, characters, and even plot points and plot devices from the previous games. You could supplant the Enclave, the Brotherhood of Steel, and the Super Mutants with entirely new factions, and you wouldn't lose anything from it. If anything, there would be a net positive gain, as you'd be adding something new to the world, and at least some of the issues present would be eliminated as a result of no longer contradicting previously established lore, or factions making choices that make no sense. As for Fallout 3 reusing elements from past games, it goes quite deep. This is something Mr. Caption has covered in his own videos, but I feel it's worth repeating here. Fallout 3 is basically a piss-poor amalgamation of Fallout 1 and 2 set on the East Coast. You start off as a vault dweller who is forced out, just like in Fallout 1. The main story ends up being about acquiring the means of producing clean drinking water, just like Fallout 1. During your journey, you learn of the super mutants who are using FEV to turn people into more super mutants, just like in Fallout 1. The Enclave are a primary antagonistic force, just like in Fallout 2. One of your main goals is to acquire a GEC, just like in Fallout 2. The leader of a strong military force, as I already mentioned, is immobile, incredibly intelligent, and can be talked into destroying himself and his base, just like in Fallout 1. And additionally to that, Harold is here, like in both Fallout 1 and 2. And as mentioned, the Brotherhood is here, like in every single fucking Fallout game. Essentially, nearly every major aspect from the original two games are here, and there seems to be little reason for it besides laziness, or maybe Bethesda thought it would be too risky to create something entirely new, with no connection to the original games. But the problem with that is the fact they took stuff that already existed and fucked it all up. Ruining something that people are familiar with is far more egregious than creating something new that's awful. Even if they did handle the Brotherhood, the Enclave, and the Super Mutants well, it probably would have been better for them to create new factions. If these major groups are on the West Coast, and they're on the East Coast, it gives the impression that this is all there is to the entire country, with little variation in between for the smaller factions. And it makes the world feel small. It also makes it feel like we're always going to be dealing with these factions all the time forever. And this is especially prevalent with the Brotherhood and the Super Mutants, both of which appear in every single Fallout game. By default, this gives the impression that we'll always see these two groups in every single new entry going forward without fail, to the point that if they were going to do a Fallout game that entirely takes place on Mars, you could be damn sure there's going to be a base full of Super Mutants and a base full of Brotherhood people. Bethesda's terrible handling of the Super Mutants in Fallout 4, especially after the criticisms they've received about them in Fallout 3, likely means the future of the Super Mutants in this series will always be bloodthirsty orcs that want to kill everything, and there will always be a contrived excuse for them to be there. As for the Brotherhood, it seems as though Bethesda thinks a Fallout game can't exist without them, to the point of bullshitting a reason for them to exist in Fallout 76. It also seems as though they don't know what to do with the Brotherhood. In Fallout 3, they're paragons of virtue, but in Fallout 4, they're basically a diet enclave. They don't want to wipe out all the impure people of the wasteland, just the super mutants and ghouls, no matter how helpful and peaceful some of them have been. The Brotherhood literally wouldn't have even been able to get into the Institute without Virgil's help, yet they demand that you kill him. I'm getting a bit off track here. Pulling this back to just Fallout 3, it doesn't really have its own identity as far as story and factions go. All of its main aspects are straight up ripped from previous games. Sure, they added in the Regulators and the Talon Company, but the former barely exists, aside from hunting down negative karma players, and the latter exists as a generic enemy faction holding random dungeons, and also hunts down positive karma players. Removing that, all that's left are the dumb set pieces and characters, and even then, in some aspects, they have to overly rely on elements from the original games. What's that? Nuka-Cola was in the originals? Well, here's a dumb cartoon character that's obsessed with it and collects anything she can related to it. I've seen people describe these games as a theme park with a Fallout coat of paint, and shit like this is the reason. This is what I meant all the way back at the start of the video when I said that Fallout 3 ultimately feels like a mediocre fan game that was made without truly understanding what Fallout was all about. The original games were largely about what came after the apocalypse, rebuilding in a nuclear wasteland, the morals and ethics of the new world arising from the ashes of the old, how humanity regresses in some ways and progresses in others. The writers and developers put in the groundwork to make their world make sense. They explain how things worked, how things came to be, and how the world reached the state it's in. The factions and groups of these games were representations of these ideas, from slavers and raiders, to the crime families of New Reno, to Vault City and their corrupt leader, to Shady Sands, which eventually evolved into the NCR, to the Gunrunners, to the Master and his army, to the Brotherhood of Steel, to the Enclave. These factions and your interactions with them weren't important because of their names or their looks, but because of the roles they played in the world, and how they progressed or were destroyed. The developers at Interplay and Black Isle Studios very clearly cared about the consistency and cohesion of their world, and it shows in the final product. These games might not be perfect, and their graphics have certainly aged, but their stories will stand the test of time. They already have in many ways. Nothing Bethesda has done with Fallout will age that well. Fallout 3 largely retreads ground we've seen already, and it does it much worse. As far as its main story goes, it adds nothing of substance to the world of Fallout. Speaking of which, that brings me to the next segment of this video. As I've mentioned, the world of Fallout 3 makes very little sense. The game as a whole fails to account for or explain how things work or why things exist the way they do. For example, one I used earlier in the video, there's no signs in the world that Liam Neeson actually traveled to GNR or Rivet City or Vault 112, but even that is minor compared to everything else. Just to clarify, what I mean is the fact there's no indication that anyone has come through any of these locations, considering the fact that there's no dead bodies of hostile creatures or other signs of being traversed. Though Liam Neeson doesn't seem like an action hero in this game, and he certainly isn't equipped for it, though it also seems unlikely he'd just be able to sneak by everything as well. Everything just appears untouched. As I mentioned earlier, it seems as though he did all this in the span of a few hours, due to the fact he's at Vault 112 the very moment you exit the vault. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that he managed to travel all this distance without leaving a single footprint anywhere, and get all this shit done by the time you make it outside. We have to take it that way though, because that's what the game portrays. Even Fallout 4 at least has the reasoning that you are frozen, so it makes sense that everything in the world is in that position by default. With Fallout 3 here, we have to assume he got the info from Moriarty, traveled to GNR, and immediately after he left, the super mutants started a siege on GNR. Then he traveled all the way to Rivet City and talked with Dr. Lee, went to Project Purity and managed to not get captured or killed by the super mutants squatting there, and apparently get some work done, then traveled to Vault 112, and he did all this within the time span from when he left the vault, which can be assumed to have happened immediately before the Overseer locked down the vault, and when the player leaves the vault. But as I mentioned, even this is minor compared to just about every other aspect of how this game's world functions. Now many of you will probably know where I'm going to start here, as this is arguably the single biggest issue with the world of Fallout 3, and this is something that both Mr. Caption and Mr. B-Tongue have covered previously, and that's the issue regarding food in the world of Fallout 3. Now I know this really shouldn't have to be explained, but food is a basic requirement for life to exist. Yet this is something that Fallout 3 fails to account for, with only a couple exceptions that I will mention shortly. The only proper food source that is explained or shown to the player is Moira, telling you to scavenge 200-year-old food from the ruins of a grocery store. Also, Rivet City apparently eats Mirelurks, but that seems untenable. They're established to be tough and damage-resistant enemies, and their only weak spot is their small faces. There's only 3 other examples of there being food sources in this game. Arafu, which has a small herd of Brahmin, but even then it seems like the entire reason they even exist is to be a point of contention because the family wiped out their Brahmin. There's the Republic of Dave, which has 1 entire Brahmin in what looks to be a small area for it to feed in, and Andale, which are cannibals, which requires them to capture other humans who themselves need a food source to even exist in the first place. The entire rest of the game completely fails to show any kind of food source for any major locations. Megaton, Tenpenny Tower, Paradise Falls, Canterbury Commons, and the Citadel lack any kind of long-term sustainable or renewable food source, and there seems to be no plants growing in the entire wasteland, with the exception of Oasis, which is a small isolated zone. Hardly anyone knows about it, and it's a somewhat recent development. So for the rest of this discussion, Oasis will be ignored because I don't want to have to say the entire wasteland except Oasis over and over again. Now the food issue is one that surprisingly sees a lot of pushback from huge fans of this game, at least judging from the comments section on some videos I did, and I find it really strange the lengths people will go to in order to defend the food issue. Now I want to stay up front that no matter what you think about this issue, this is massively important to the world of Fallout 3. I would hope this wouldn't need to be spelled out for people, but considering some of the responses I've gotten, it's worth stating this as plainly as possible. The world of Fallout 3 literally cannot exist without food. At all. In any way, shape, or form. Because there is no food, no one has anything to eat, and because no one has anything to eat, they're all dead, and this also applies to the wildlife. Everything is dead. There's absolutely zero life in the capital wasteland. This is because there is absolutely no plant life growing whatsoever in the entire game. It's all burned out shrubs, grass, and trees that were scorched in nuclear fire. If there are no plants, the herbivores have nothing to eat and they starve and die. If there are no herbivores, then the carnivores have nothing to eat besides each other, and that is not sustainable, and they will eventually die out too. If there are no plants and there are no animals, then humans have nothing to eat, and they starve and die out too. This is an extremely simple concept, and the fact that people actually argue against it is kind of mind-blowing. Now I want to address some of these defense arguments in an attempt to put them to bed. As it turns out, this also happens to be the best way to go in-depth on this subject, to the point that simply responding to these arguments alone will more than prove this point, so I don't have to discuss it on its own. I understand there will always be people who will defend these issues no matter what, but it's worth proving that some of the more common defenses are complete bunk. They get food from caravans. No, this is unsustainable. Each of these major settlements would require daily shipments in order to survive, and this would be costly. Ain't nothing free in the wasteland, folks. Most settlements don't produce anything to trade with the caravans. Megaton arguably has a water processing plant so they can use semi-purified water to trade, but every other location is shit out of luck. Tenpenny Tower doesn't produce anything. It's a bunch of LARPing dipshits who think they're rich socialites when they're really just a bunch of random assholes pretending they're upper class. Even if they did have the money, they would eventually run out. That's what happens when you spend money when you have no income. Paradise Falls doesn't produce anything either, and yes, I know they have slaves, but that's something I'm going to discuss a bit later, because that's probably one of the most absolute stupid fucking things this game did. I don't believe Rivet City produces anything to trade either. See, this is one of the big issues with the apocalypse. They don't have the systems in place that allow cities to continue existing as the real-world cities do. So in order to survive, they need to be either mostly or entirely self-sufficient, and if they're not, they need to produce something in order to trade with other settlements that have an excess of food or other resources to trade. Taking the Elder Scrolls games, for example, which all have plenty of farms in them, this is a world with businesses and government, so it can be reasonably assumed that there are countless trade deals in place to keep these locations functional and operational. I don't need to see a trade caravan sitting outside Balmora or Coral or Whiterun in order to understand that food is delivered to the city for people to buy, and that residents of the city have some kind of jobs that allow them to pay for that food and other things they would need, because it can be reasonably assumed due to a structured society existing. Many people make this assumption with Fallout 3, and it doesn't apply here. Just to quickly make the term clear, for anyone who doesn't understand what I mean, a reasonable assumption is when you can come to a basic conclusion about something using basic logic and information without explicitly being shown. For example, I don't necessarily need to see bees pollinating flowers in a game to understand that the process would need to happen in order for them to exist. Realistically, only so much can be portrayed in a game, and it's a bit unnecessary to account for bees existing in a world when development time would be better spent on more important aspects of the game. I also don't need to see farms existing in Grand Theft Auto to understand that various restaurants in the game get their food from somewhere, even though some of the games do have farms. But being the apocalypse, games like Fallout 3 have to take care to explicitly show how characters get their basic necessities. The lack of food is an important issue because it's a fundamental aspect of surviving and just living in general, and additionally, that's a major part of any post-apocalypse story. Food is now scarce, due to the fact there is no system in place to import or produce and disperse food through a region. Food and water are the two most important things necessary in order to survive. But this is a far bigger deal in a post-apocalypse setting, with defense from hostile creatures or people, as well as shelter coming in closely behind. Additionally, in order for caravans to deliver food, they would kinda need their own food source too, which they do not have. There are no farms in Canterbury Commons, and there's only a few Brahmin, which are arguably used for their caravans. The next argument is a couple I'm lumping into one discussion. It's actually not a major issue. It doesn't matter because most people didn't notice or criticize it. Professional critics and reviewers didn't see it as an issue. Plenty of people liked the game and didn't complain about it. No! These defenses are just fucking stupid and are basically the equivalent of giving up on the argument. First off, professional critics and reviewers typically don't do in-depth analysis. Their jobs are to give generalized reviews of the games, not talk about the intricacies of how the world functions. Additionally, claiming that professional critic or reviewer opinions are more important than anyone else's opinions is an appeal to authority. I received a similar comment on one of my Star Wars videos, where someone basically told me that because professional critics reviewed some movies poorly, that meant they're bad movies. Yeah, sorry, but that's bad reasoning. The only major difference between professional critics and any other kind of critic is the fact that one is a paid job. Professional critics can be just as biased as anyone else, and they can either be paid off for good reviews, or feel forced to write good reviews for other games in order to gain access to future releases. Professional reviews are a joke and should typically be taken as such. Honesty and objectivity are what matter. Next, the lack of criticism does not mean a lack of an issue. Just because someone didn't notice or complain about a flaw does not mean it doesn't exist. If there's a fucking dead body on a sidewalk and 10,000 people walk by without realizing it, that does not mean there isn't a dead fucking body on the sidewalk. That's what I call an appeal to the majority, which is similar to an appeal to popularity and an appeal to a success, which, as can be assumed from their names, is when someone argues that something must be good because it was popular or successful. An appeal to the majority is when you make a claim on the basis of how most people act or feel about something. In this case, most people didn't notice the issue, therefore it's not a big deal. I actually had someone in my comments section arguing these points with me, that the entire wasteland having no food, and therefore being unable to survive, was only a minor issue. I'd like to state again for the record that food is an essential part of living that we need daily to keep existing, and the world of Fallout 3 shows no adequate food source to exist, which means the world cannot exist as we see it. It doesn't matter how many people do or don't care about this issue. It exists, and it's a major flaw of the game, especially when you take into consideration that the entire main story is about a lack of water, the counterpart to food being a necessity of life. There's hunters in the world that probably trade with the settlements. There's animals shown to be near a location, so it must be their food source. Similar to caravans, this would not be sustainable. Hunting could supplement the food supply, but cannot sustain a fixed settlement because not only do animals have a tendency to migrate and not just stay in one single location, but there would simply not be enough animal life around a city to sustain it for the long term. Similarly, naturally growing food such as vegetables, fruits, and berries would get depleted as people and animals ate them in order to survive, though this would be irrelevant in this situation anyway since there are no plants growing in the capital wasteland. This is the reason hunter-gatherer societies moved around and didn't stay in just one location, because the availability of food changed due to the changing seasons and due to them consuming it. And this is why it's so important to show farms existing, something Bethesda had absolutely no problem with in Oblivion, and especially Morrowind, and it's something they also had in Skyrim, and additionally they corrected this mistake in Fallout 4. It's rare for me to say anything positive about that steaming pile of shit, but they did add some farms to the game world, and even Diamond City. Even though that does have its own issues and will be discussed further in that video series. I've also seen people cite Mirelurks as a food source for Rivet City. While I'm certainly not an expert on how radiation works, I get the impression that eating an animal that spends most of its life in radioactive water isn't the best of ideas. And as we learn in Broken Steel, purified water actually kills Mirelurks. In fact, Fallout 3 itself supports this idea, as there's a log on a doctor's terminal saying that brain-dead idiots keep eating fish and getting sick. But even barring that, Mirelurks are somewhat dangerous and difficult to kill due to their shells being so hard. Even when I've brought that up before, they would probably take more ammo than it's worth to kill them. People have legitimately argued back that they live on a warship and there should be plenty of ammo on board, as if it wouldn't eventually fucking run out, especially when they allegedly need to defend themselves from other threats. It doesn't matter the food isn't shown to be growing, it is clearly implied they get food from somewhere because they have food. And this is where you've given up on trying to present any kind of logical argument in favor of essentially saying, it's fine because reasons. Yes, food items do exist in the game. No one is disputing that. The issue is that it's never shown where they get this food from. I'd even be willing to forgive the squirrel and iguana bits, since I don't expect those small critters to be modeled for the game. But those alone still will not be sustainable for reasons previously given. The idea that a food source is only ever implied and not actually shown in a world that is fully modeled and rendered is ridiculous. There's no good reason to not show any kind of food growing anywhere in the world in this type of game, especially when Bethesda has done it before with no problem. I actually had someone argue with me that Canterbury Commons totally has enough food growing to feed the entire wasteland, it's just not depicted in-game. I have to assume this is just someone trolling at this point, and not someone seriously making an argument this fucking stupid. There's nothing growing in the capital wasteland because it was nuked harder than any other area in the country. While it does make sense that the capital would be the hardest hit by the bombs, this is still not an excuse. What you're arguing here is the reason that plant life wouldn't exist in the capital wasteland, but that still leaves the obvious problem of people and animals existing that would need food to survive. I don't even know if this was a specific choice by the writers or by the world designers, but even if they do have good justification for there being absolutely no plant life, that still leaves the massive issue of people having no food to eat in a game that's about a dire need of clean drinking water. It just blows my mind that the main story can be about one, and the entire game world fails to account for the other. The game designers could have made just about any reasoning or excuse for there being plant life still growing in the capital wasteland, in order to explain where people get their food from. Maybe there was some kind of pre-war experiment to allow plants to grow rapidly in dire conditions, or something. They could have done anything. And that's the major arguments I've seen in response to this point. The thing is, I'm not even asking for a whole lot here. The farms in New Vegas don't have enough food to realistically sustain the towns long term, but at least shows that they are growing food, which is enough. The issue of food becomes exponentially worse when you consider the Enclave also happens to eat 200-year-old irradiated food, and they don't appear to have any other food source of their own. Just a reminder, the Enclave are the guys who believe in the purity of their DNA, and anyone tainted by radiation or FEV are viewed as degenerate mutant scum. The thing about these games is that it's impossible to show you things to their full scale, and this has always been the case with Bethesda games. It's why you can have cities like what you see in Oblivion or Skyrim that only have a few dozen NPCs in them. Realistically, these locations would have thousands of people living there, but that's just impossible to portray in these games. Not to mention, it would become hard for the player to get anything done in a city with thousands of buildings that are fully modeled inside and out, with thousands of NPCs to go along with them. Even in these Bethesda games, they state that the vault capacity for all these vaults is 1,000 people, even though none of them are big enough to realistically house all those people, and I'm fine with that. All Megaton or Tenpenny Tower or anywhere else in the wasteland would really need is a farm or two with some crops growing, and several ramen to show they have a renewable source of food. And I've already mentioned it, but for the people who still want to argue this point with me, this is an issue that Bethesda acknowledged and went out of their way to fix in Fallout 4. Because even if naturally growing food was only added for the settlement building system, they still put crops in Diamond City, which you cannot build in, which shows a level of attention to detail they clearly did not have when it comes to Fallout 3. It's really too bad they didn't have that attention to detail with literally any other part of Fallout 4. Next up is Megaton, and how ridiculous this town is. Megaton is built around an active nuclear bomb, because I suppose everyone in this game is just a brain-dead fucking idiot. The official story in-game is that a plane was shot down and crashed there, creating the crater, even though the impact of a plane wouldn't create a crater that big. Anyways, apparently there were terrible dust storms at the time, and people took shelter in the crater because of it. The dust storms eventually died down, but people kept returning there to trade and eventually evolved into a trade hub. They ended up dismantling the plane and using its parts to build the town, along with other scrap they salvaged from an airport a few miles away from the crater. There were already whack jobs worshipping the bomb by this point, so they didn't get rid of it or dismantle it too, due to receiving help from the whack jobs when building the town. That's the backstory for Megaton, and it's fucking stupid. It took them months to drag the scrap from the airport to build the town, but for some reason they just accepted the crater with this bomb instead of somewhere safer? See, it's shit like this that makes me not take this game, its characters, or its world seriously at all. There's absolutely no good reason whatsoever to build a town around a nuclear fucking bomb. Everyone is just fine with living right next to something that can vaporize them in an instant. It's the very thing that just ended the civilized world, and their bright fucking idea is to try to rebuild civilization around it. It just makes no sense. The reason given in-game is that they needed the help from the Children of Adam followers, but it's even stated that the religion was only just getting started back then, so it really makes me wonder how much extra help they would have been. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of Adam followers in Megaton as it is, and I'm unaware of any others existing in the Capital Wasteland, so I doubt there was enough of them to make a difference. This is also not even counting the fact that the people who first settled Megaton were pre-war. They were denied access to Vault 101 when the bombs dropped. So why the fuck would these idiots start worshipping a fucking nuke when it just ended their way of life? Not sure where all those fucking skeletons came from in front of the vault, if the people who were denied entry were able to survive and settle in the crater. They literally say it took months to drag the scrap metal from the airport to Megaton to build it, and not once did they think it might actually be worth it to move the bomb or, you know, just build a fucking town somewhere else. See, that's the thing about building a town. Typically you would want to build it near some kind of resource like food or water, or maybe precious metals, or a defensible location. Instead, they just decided to build it around a nuke. Also, they say the airport was completely scrapped except for the planes, and once those were gone, you wouldn't even know an airport had ever been there, which is quite the excuse to not put the airport into the game at all. Everything else was scrapped apparently, including all the concrete and steel walls, and only the planes were left. And they managed to drag all the steel across miles of the wasteland over the course of many months, and I guess didn't get killed by wildlife or raiders or super mutants, and they also didn't die of hunger in a world without food. I mean, at this point it might have made more sense to just build the fucking town where the airport was. What sense is there in dragging the scraps of numerous planes to the crater when most of the material to build the town was at the airport? They took the more dangerous option of hauling the scrap to build around a bomb that could kill them and destroy their town in an instant. There's just no goddamn logic to this shit. But this gets even fucking worse. Someone in the comments of my response to Many a True Nerd raised some great fucking points about building in a crater, and how it's basically the most fucking retarded thing you could ever do when building a town. In fact, I'm a bit embarrassed at the fact I never took these things into consideration when doing the response video. So first off, many pre-industrial towns and cities were built on hills rather than valleys or lowlands, due to the sheer advantage of height. First off, you have a better vantage point to see incoming attackers, as opposed to building in lowlands or on flat land. You also have gravity working on your side for those using ranged weapons. Now I realize archery isn't in Fallout, but it is a good example here, as you would have gravity working against the enemy trying to shoot up at a fortified location, and it would be working with you shooting down towards them. Keep in mind, in a dire situation, anything can be used as a projectile too, so if the town were under siege by raiders, it's totally an effective tactic to throw rocks and chunks of concrete and scrap metal to injure or kill their attackers. Lowlands were really only ever good for farming if the ground was fertile or near a water source. But there's also the fact that low areas can flood. If torrential rains hit the Capital Wasteland, then most of Megaton would flood very quickly, and the whole town gets fucked over. Considering it's all made of roughly nailed together scrap, you gotta wonder how well the supports would hold when submerged, and the dirt they're resting on turns muddy. Now I realize it doesn't rain in-game, but that's an issue on Bethesda's part. We're clearly shown rain in Fallout 4, and this was something they did again in both Morrowind and Oblivion. I have no idea why they excluded rain from Fallout 3, but it's fucking stupid since DC typically gets a lot of rain. Maybe it was a technical limitation of some kind, but I still don't understand how Fallout 3 could be limited in that regard, when Bethesda's previous games on the same system had rain too. Anyways, I'm getting a bit off track here. The point is, if flooding occurred for some reason, which can absolutely fucking happen in Washington, D.C., then Megaton would be fucked. It's basically a giant basin with no drainage, so it's going to fill up with water. If Megaton had been built on a hill instead, then this would have at least been less of an issue. If they were to get heavy rain, it would naturally drain outwards away from the city, and in order to deal with flood-like conditions, they would need the water level to rise higher than the hill they've settled on, which would be an absurd amount of water. You also have to factor in other aspects to a flow of water too. In a town like Megaton, all of the garbage and dust and dirt and scraps of food and other such things are going to flow downwards into the center of town. Megaton has 2 washrooms in it. If their sewage pipes were to leak for some reason, guess where it's going? Yep, straight down into the center of town. And it's stuff like this that not only allows disease to fester, but also attracts vermin like rats or cockroaches. If the town were instead built on a hill, then all that garbage and filth would drain away from the city naturally with the rain. Megaton is just a complete disaster on every level. Next up is Little Lamplight, a town of children living in a cave. Surprisingly enough, Bethesda actually gives them a food source. Cave mold. I'm not so sure that's a sustainable food source. It just doesn't seem that substantive to me. Also, they would need ungodly amounts of cave mold to eat, and this topic is already making me sick. So moving the fuck away from that at Warp 10, the game shows us all these kids living here, but completely fails to account for where they even come from. Yeah, Bethesda just builds a shitty set piece and forces it into the main quest and forces you to deal with these shitty children. They don't even come up with a reason for them being here. As I explained earlier, the cave was initially inhabited by children after the bombs dropped, due to a field trip from some local schools. This is Bethesda's backstory for there being children in the cave. This happened 200 years ago in the timeline, which means there shouldn't be any more children here. This is fucking ridiculous, Bethesda. What the fuck are you doing? Fallout 3 is full of gimmicky set pieces, but Lamplight and Megaton are probably tied for being the worst of them all. I know people are going to start theorizing in the comments about how children might reach Lamplight, and I'm going to stop you right there. I really don't mean to be rude here, but it does not matter what your theories are. If the game fails to explain something, that is an objective fault of the game, and no amount of fan theories will fix this issue, because at the end of the day, fan theories are not canon, and if you've reached a point where you have to start making your own reasoning for things existing this way, then you're doing the writing for the writers, and they failed at their job of creating a story that makes any kind of logical sense. There is one argument I've seen in particular, where the theory is that Big Town sends its children to Lamplight, but again, this is never explained or explicitly shown, and it's just a fan theory. The argument being that Big Town is the only town in the game without children, which is false. Tenpenny Tower also does not have children. You can send Brian Wilkes to Lamplight during the quest to those, but I don't believe that random children being sent to Lamplight is how they get children. Based on what we see in the Wasteland, a child wouldn't have much of a chance to even make it there all on their own. Especially when they have no supplies or map to even lead them there. Brian Wilkes makes it there due to sheer luck of being an immortal in a Bethesda game, because children can't be killed. But that's a gameplay mechanic if anything, and certainly not an in-universe lore explanation. Realistically speaking, any kid traveling to Lamplight is at just as much risk to the various dangers of the Wasteland as any other character in the world would be. Slavers, mutated animals, super mutants, raiders, cannibals, and so on. Also, as I explained earlier, they're camped on the back doorstep of the largest super mutant base in the game. It's literally the source of the super mutants, and despite that, they've been unable to break into Lamplight because plot convenience, I guess. You have this massively powerful force that infests the DC ruins and is an extreme danger in every other encounter. They regularly kidnap people with ease. They're armed with some of the most powerful weapons available. They have superhuman strength. The Brotherhood of Steel had to pull back their defense of the wasteland because the super mutant threat was so great, and they regularly lose men to them. And yet these kids just have an absolutely perfect defense to the point that super mutants can't do anything at all to get into Lamplight. They can't shoot apart the barricade or use their missile launchers or even use their raw strength to tear apart this barricade that's very clearly made of scrap wood. This ends up being a very common trend with Bethesda Fallout, where they'll have an idea for a unique location and put it into the game, but don't properly account for how or why it exists, or when they do try to account for it, their reasoning is complete nonsense. Case in point, Paradise Falls. Can anyone tell me what Paradise Falls is all about? Most people would respond that they're slavers. Sure, they engage in taking people as slaves, but why? Now I want everyone watching this video to stop for a moment and consider this question. Pause the video if you need to. Who does Paradise Falls sell slaves to? Who are their customers? Tenpenny Tower doesn't own any slaves. Neither does Rivet City. Or Canterbury Commons. The Brotherhood certainly doesn't have any slaves. And Megaton technically only has one. Gob. Moriarty bought Gob as a slave, and though Gob is technically free, he's stuck in Moriarty's paying off his debt. One slave in the entire wasteland, and he was sold 15 years ago. Isn't that amazing? Eulogy Jones sure is running a tight market here. Oh sure, there's the escaped slaves in the head of Sidequest, but where did they escape from? More slavers with no customers to sell to? Now a DLC would attempt to correct this grievous mistake, but that's a lame patchwork fix for the issue at best. Not to mention, the pit, in its current iteration, has only been established for about 20 years at most, so them buying slaves doesn't account for the many decades Paradise Falls has operated on prior to that. Bethesda goes so far as to create this town centered all around slavery with a backstory of how the town was founded, and how they're so aggressive about enslaving people that they've wiped entire towns off the map, and they even have at least 3 full-on quests to deal with the issue of slavery. Keep in mind, that's 3 quests out of a total of 18, or technically 4 out of 18 if you count the replicated man as well, which is very clearly about a man being taken away against his will to be put back into servitude to the Institute, which is roughly 23% of the named quests in the game. Bethesda puts all that shit into the game to show how horrible slavery is, yet they completely fail to account for anyone actually buying or using slaves. They've got no customer base, no one to sell to, and no one in the Capital Wasteland even uses slaves for any purpose. This is the same company that just 6 years earlier made Morrowind, which had slavery all over the fucking place. There were slave markets in the game, and there were farms, mines, and even full-on plantations that had dozens of slaves, and even an entire underground resistance movement based around freeing slaves. I sincerely hope it's becoming abundantly clear by this point that Bethesda is either putting in no effort into the world building of these games, or they just don't care. They put in just enough explanation in some cases to make things look fine on surface level, but if you dig any deeper, or even, God forbid, have the sheer audacity to even think about some of these issues, you realize that almost everything in this game makes no fucking sense at all. And to bring this around once again, this is a major part of why this game feels like a mediocre fan game to many people. The original games took the time to explain and show how things worked in the world. One of the best examples is the FEV itself. There's detailed logs of how and why it was developed, how the project itself evolved from simply intending to create an immunity to bioweapons to a full-on super soldier program, and even what exactly it did to DNA to cause these changes. Even with New Vegas, the developers had plans and ideas in mind for aspects such as where they get their food, or even how the government works. Unfortunately, much of that was cut due to limitations, but the intention was there, and some level of it did make it into the game. Bethesda, with their massive budget and years to work on the game, just slapped a bunch of set pieces together, made up some bullshit excuses for them without even really thinking deeply on them, and called it a day. And yet people still wonder why Fallout 3 and 4 and 76 and Bethesda in general are criticized so much for their treatment of the series. They've taken one of the best RPG series and dumbed it down into dumbfuck wacky post-apocalypse shooter game, and they haven't even added anything of value to the lore or world. Even New Vegas is a product of Obsidian, and their additions to the lore aren't the work of Bethesda. Continuing on with this theme, we have the Talon Company, who, much like the Gunners in Fallout 4, exist simply as raiders with a purpose. Raiders in these games are just generic enemies that exist to be a hostile force controlling a location. Both the Gunners and the Talon Company are mercenaries that you can never actually hire and are permanently hostile to you by default. The difference being they have some utility for story purposes, even if it is piss poor, and as much as I hate to do this, I actually have to give credit to Fallout 4 here again, because even the Gunners, as dumb as they fucking are in that game, still have more of a purpose and defined backstory than the Talon Company does in this one. I didn't know much about the group before looking them up for this video, but as it turns out, there wasn't jack shit to them in the first place. Yeah, here's their backstory. They're working for an unknown third party to keep the Capital Wasteland a lawless and disorganized place. Oh, I see. So the reason the Capital Wasteland looks like the bombs only dropped 10 years ago is because some shadowy figure we never see, hear, or deal with, and thus have no way of ever knowing his motivation, has enough money to hire an entire mercenary group to keep the entire region in lawless chaos. For no reason. This is amazing. This is actually worse than fucking nothing at all. That's impressive, Bethesda. According to the wiki, this isn't even in the game either. This was from the official game guide, so it's entirely worthless as far as an actual backstory or reasoning goes. You shouldn't need third-party content or outside information for a game to make sense. Such information should be available in-game by default. So the Talon Company really are just fancy raiders with no other purpose than to be hostile NPCs and hunt down good players. In similar fashion are the Regulators, who exist solely as a group of lawbringers to hunt down negative karma players or turn in the fingers of evil characters you kill for a reward. They're supposed to be trying to bring law and order back in the wasteland and keep the peace, but they're never actually shown to exist outside the two examples I just gave you. The excuse for this in-game is that you never see them because the only time you would see them is immediately before they kill you. That's it. That's all the lore there is to the amazing faction of the Regulators. While there are clearly moments in this game where Bethesda tries to set up interesting scenarios and stories for you to see and encounter, there's also very clearly a lack of logic or any sense of depth applied to the world as a whole. This is arguably far worse in Fallout 4 because you could see the potential for so many good ideas that were never developed and were either meaningless or fell short as a result. The best descriptor for Fallout 4 is missed potential. But the best descriptor for Fallout 3 is they didn't even really try. There's so many examples in this game, but possibly one of the best examples I could think of is the Preacher encounter in the DC ruins. You come upon this zone to hear a man yelling over speakers about the worm and how he'll blow it up along with everyone else. Surely this could lead to some kind of quest or interesting encounter or something, right? Upon finding this alleyway, you find a nameless wastelander who has been held hostage by this man and his explosives, even though he's well out of range of the explosives. He says the Preacher has been up there yelling for days, but will blow anyone up who gets close. You could talk this rando into running into the alley and getting himself and the Preacher killed with the explosives, or you can go in yourself and get killed. That's it. That's the encounter. You can't talk to this man, you can't bargain or persuade him, you can't do a quest for him to find this worm he's complaining about, nothing. It's just some random nameless madman holding some random nameless wastelander hostage, and you either leave him to his yelling or he blows up and dies. And because of shit like that, Fallout 3 feels more like a bunch of random neat ideas that are haphazardly stitched together without any rhyme or reason, and without any care for how or why any of it worked or existed. This could have been a really interesting encounter if it had been developed more, but it wasn't. Yet another good example is Moriarty's Saloon in Megaton. In H. Farmer Guy's video, he basically says that Megaton never got fully developed because it can be blown up. Doing so would require Bethesda to write a version of Megaton that doesn't get blown up, and this is one of the most clear examples of this happening. If you kill Moriarty, Gob will eventually take over the saloon. He'll paint his name over Moriarty's, and Nova will stop being a prostitute. But there's no dialogue to account for this. Gob doesn't get any additional lines to reflect his change, so what's the point in even having it? It's a small visual change few people will notice because the sign is so high up. In similar fashion, Nathan, the Enclave supporter in Megaton, cannot be informed of their arrival, nor does he have anything to say about this fact, even though the only thing he ever does is talk about how great the Enclave is. He can also be found in their base if he's still alive at that point, and hilariously enough, if you enter Raven Rock before Megaton, he'll still appear in Megaton spouting off about how great the Enclave is. Otherwise, I think he just disappears from the game and no one seems to notice or care. None of the NPCs in Megaton have any development beyond the bare minimum in a series that's all about world and characters. Taking Nathan as the example, he's nothing more than a dumb cartoon character. He doesn't really stand for anything, and he's nothing more than a joke character, and the game treats him as such. They even gave him a goofy voice. He has an undying loyalty to the Enclave, even though he knows nothing about them, and they have no presence in the wasteland, and he's overly patriotic to a country that is dead. If Bethesda had instead focused more on character and world building, you could have had a unique scenario where you help Nathan escape from the Enclave base, and he learns and grows from his experience. Or rather, they could have written him differently from the very start. Maybe have him be an ex-Enclave officer, which could potentially be a more interesting way to introduce the player to the faction, without blatantly giving away that the Enclave are already here. Have him get a bit more involved with the story due to his experience and knowledge of the Enclave. There's so many possibilities here that could be explored, even with the version of Nathan we actually got. Instead, he ended up being nothing more than a punchline to a joke no one cared about. Look, he's a super supporter of the Enclave, then they kidnapped him. So funny. Not every character in Megaton is a joke like Nathan, Moira, or Professor Cornhole. Other characters have basically nothing to them. Take Lucy West for example. Well, she has a quest for you to do, but that's it. There's nothing else to talk to Lucy West about. Jericho is a retired raider, whatever fuck that's supposed to mean. Manya is a lore dump. Lucas Sims doesn't have much to talk about. Some basic directions around Megaton as he's the first person you talk to upon entering the city, the dialogue needed for Power of the Atom, and the bare minimum amount of dialogue for finding your father, and besides that, nothing of note. Now, I'm not saying every single character in a town has to be the most well-developed or have a ton of character to them, but it's quite obvious that as far as Megaton goes, most of these characters have the bare minimum of development. In most of these games, a lot of the side NPCs don't really matter all that much, and that's fine. But usually quest givers or important lore characters are supposed to at least be a bit more well-developed than this. Lucas Sims is a great example of this. He's the town sheriff and mayor. He basically runs the town, but even if you do disarm the bomb, depending on your actions, he might get killed by Mr. Burke anyways. So he doesn't get much development, and most of his dialogue is only ever relevant to Power of the Atom, and general introducing the player to a town stuff. Another issue I have with Bethesda's games, starting with Fallout 3, but this also applies to Skyrim and Fallout 4 as well, is the fact they keep shoving in these obnoxious, upper-class snob characters who don't actually have any right or justification for acting the way they do. There's certainly rich snobs in the real world, and I don't doubt these characters aren't far from the mark when it comes to parodying them, but the problem I have is the fact that it isn't earned in these games. Nazim in Skyrim is best known for asking you if you go to the Cloud District often, before stopping himself, as if the very question is ridiculous because you're a poor troglodyte, I guess. But this has three major problems. First, and least of all actually, the Cloud District has only 3 fucking buildings. To have such importance put on such a place as to call it a district is just stupid and annoying. Secondly, the player is the legendary hero of myth, the Dragonborn, which is an indisputable fact. By default, you're a legend to most of the people of Skyrim. Finally, the Nazim doesn't even have his own fucking house. It doesn't exist. The issue with the rich snob characters is far worse in the world of Fallout, though. This goes back to the whole structured society thing I was talking about earlier. Due to the fact there's no government and generally no businesses, at least on this side of America, it doesn't make much sense that anyone can be rich or that there could be this much of a class difference between rich and poor. Nelson Latimer can kinda sorta be excused because he was involved in a massive drug heist, so it can be assumed he obtained his wealth thanks to that. and Daring Dashwood can be assumed to have made some decent money during his adventures, even though realistically they probably should have burned through a great deal of that money by now. But still an issue with the other characters, especially in Tenpenny Tower. Besides the guards, of course, just about everyone in Tenpenny Tower is portrayed as being wealthy when there's very little reason for it. In a series like The Elder Scrolls, it can be reasonably assumed that any overly wealthy characters are a result of any number of typical means in a structured society, such as business ventures, organized crime, or even gambling. The issue with Fallout 3 is that none of those are really possible on that level, nor are they portrayed. Tenpenny Tower has a few merchants, sure, but Tenpenny Tower is also a gated community. They typically don't let the dirty outsiders in, and it's never shown that outsiders are trading with anyone at Tenpenny Tower. They essentially have a closed economy, but the problem is no one produces anything, and there's no reason given for any of them to be wealthy, besides the game simply saying they are. This goes back to the food question. If they don't get supplies from outside the tower and they don't grow their own food, then they've got nothing to eat and they're all dead. But even if they did buy food and have it shipped to them, they still don't have anything to sell or trade in return, and can't buy food as a result, which means they're all dead. No one in Tenpenny Tower is a scavenger, that's for damn sure. What makes Edgar Wellington or Irving Chang any different in terms of wealth than Lucy West or Manya and Nathan, besides a completely arbitrary decision made by the developers? If you're Alistair Tenpenny and you're considering allowing a new tenant to rent or buy a suite there, what is the deciding factor? It sure as fuck can't be wealth in a world where achieving such wealth seems damn near impossible. If these characters had a little bit of backstory in which they own a caravan company or have control over a weapons manufacturing facility or anything of the sort, this would be far less of an issue. Let's say, for example, Edgar Wellington owned and managed a business similar to the Gunrunners. It's a project either passed down to him or that he started up on his own. People need weapons to survive in the brutal wasteland, so that's what he produces, along with a small workforce that probably wouldn't be allowed into the tower. Now this character has a functional source for his wealth. Wastelanders pay Edgar Wellington for his weapons, he pays his employees so they have money to buy food and the things they need, he has his own share from his sales that he pays to live in Tenpenny Tower with, he pays merchants for food, clothes and materials, and so forth. It's little things like that that would make the world seem as though there is actual thought put into how it functions. There's very little of this as it stands in the game. Some characters do have jobs that are a requirement for towns existing, but most characters do jack-dilly shit all fucking day with nothing to show for it. There's plenty of examples in this game too, such as this character in Rivet City who claims to clean the place up, which brings me to yet another issue. Now this is arguably a far bigger issue of Fallout 4, and don't fucking worry, I'll get to that in the next part of that analysis series, but it's still an issue here, and that's the fact that everyone in this world is apparently fine with living in complete squalor. Tenpenny Tower is the only major location that doesn't have random junk lying around, which I find absolutely mind-blowing. You would think people have cleaned up their living spaces a bit more than not at fucking all, but no. People are just perfectly fine with living in literal trash strewn about the place. This gets far worse when you start bringing in 200-year-old fucking skeletons into the equation, such as in Paradise Falls. In the main building, the home of Eulogy Jones, you could just find a random fucking skeleton just lying there. Keep in mind, Paradise Falls has been running for decades, close to a century at least, if not more, and has had at least 2 previous owners described by the game, Gross's father, and some raider bitch that appeared in Daring Dashwood's adventures, and none of them decided to maybe remove the 200-year-old fucking corpse from their house. Nah mate, just sweep it into a fucking corner, it'll be fine. It's one thing to live in the ruins of an ancient building or build shelter out of scrap, but it's another issue entirely to just not give a shit and be chill with garbage, rubble, and debris lying everywhere. Most of this is what contributes to the world feeling like it's only been a few years since the bombs dropped, not 200. This is made exponentially worse by the fact that no one is fucking building or making anything that's entirely new. Everyone is either living in the burned out ruins of the old world, or shacks made of scrap. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing on its own. There's many locations in New Vegas where people live in clearly pre-war buildings, and some live in shacks where needed. But the difference is, most of these living spaces are kept comparatively clean. There's an effort shown to provide a separation between living space and ruins. Now on top of that, there's clearly attempts at rebuilding different versions of society, represented in the 3 main factions. There's progress. It's shown there's an effort to help people. It's shown that there's weapons manufacturers who are creating new weapons. There's farms. One of the major key differences between New Vegas and Fallout 3 is the fact that the developers of New Vegas very clearly cared about their world building and how certain things worked, how their world functions, whereas Bethesda only seemed interested in gimmicky set pieces with little rhyme or reason for them to exist the way they do. Oh look, a Mad Max looking town. Oh look, a town full of children. Oh look, a city and a ship. Even Megaton being made entirely of scrap could have been forgiven if there was good reason for it, but there wasn't. There's also the issue of Galaxy News Radio, Three Dog and his good fight. Now if you've seen my response to Many a True Nerd, then a good chunk of this section will be very familiar, and that's the portrayal of Three Dog's news reports. Three Dog is in the middle of the DC ruins, and he never leaves. He doesn't exactly have a reliable line of communication from the outside world. As a result, it's really weird that he can report on news events involving the player moments after they happened. He also apparently just takes all the information he receives at face value. Rather than neutrally reporting on what's happening in the wasteland, Three Dog colorizes events based on his perspective and worldview, directly praising or calling out the player for their actions. While this might be a good idea on paper, the implementation of this is horrible due to the fact he cannot know all the facts or details of a given situation. The prime example being the option of nuking Megaton. If you blow up the town, he doesn't outright say you did it, but he heavily implies that it was you without actually knowing for a fact if it was you or not. The problem with this is the implication that he treats every news story in this fashion. As a result, could easily end up with innocent people getting hurt or killed. Three Dog is right about the player's action through sheer virtue of the game being coded that way, though sometimes his news reports fuck up quite significantly and don't play properly. But the intention by the developers is there as evidence when they do work correctly. If he reports on every story as he does with the player, this could result in people taking retaliatory action against whoever the subject of Three Dog's news reports might be, and due to not being able to verify the facts, Three Dog might be reporting false information for any number of reasons, such as speculation or not knowing the full details of events, or even a source full-on intentionally misleading Three Dog. Imagine if some nefarious character blamed their misdeeds on other characters, to take public blame away from themselves, and Three Dog reports that these other characters are responsible for the misdeeds. Then they might have to face the consequences as a result. I used a hypothetical in my response to Many a True Nerd, in a scenario where the Lone Wanderer didn't exist, and if the Megaton bomb had deteriorated to the point where it might set itself off. You might end up with a situation where a traveling merchant visits Megaton, then Tenpenny Tower a few days later, and while he's at Tenpenny Tower, the bomb happens to go off on its own. Three Dog's resulting news report, based on the same information as we see with the player in-game, would result in him blaming this random merchant, who now has the biggest target in the world on his back, for being accused of blowing up the town. Bounty hunters might want to kill or capture him. Relatives of the people who lived in Megaton might want him dead. The dude is totally fucked now thanks to Three Dog's bias and inability to confirm any factual information. The way it comes off in-game, it's as if he's clairvoyant and just knows everything that happens the moment it does. But realistically, that's not the case, and he's just some asshole who spouts off without actually knowing what the fuck he's talking about. But there's other issues here with him and his radio station. It seems as though most of his reports are based entirely around the player's action, as if there's nothing else going on in the wasteland. Sure, he does have a few generic reports that likely exist to fill space for the period when the player isn't completing quests, or to direct the player to different areas of the game. But for the most part, all he fucking talks about is what the player is doing, either praising or condemning them for their actions. As a result, this makes the world feel incredibly small, as though you, the player, are the center of the universe, and the only thing that matters in the game world. What could have been more interesting had they done this is have new quests and events open up to the player as they progress through the game. This does kind of exist with Trouble on the Home Front, as it only happens after the Enclave takes control of Project Purity, though you don't learn about it from Three Dog, but some expansion to this idea of events occurring outside the player's influence, and becoming available after a set in-game time, or after completing so many quests would be an interesting way to show that stuff is happening in the world, besides what the player is doing. And players can either discover these quests completely naturally, or through listening to Three Dog's radio broadcasts that talk about things happening in different locations, rather than solely focusing on the player. As it stands in-game, right now, It just comes off as really weird that Three Dog has this laser focus on you and nothing else. The final aspect to talk about in regards to Three Dog is his good fight. You end up learning about the good fight from Three Dog himself when you encounter him at Galaxy News Radio, and he explains that it's a fight of righteousness, good versus evil, helping the innocent and making things more difficult for the bad guys, that sort of thing. It's something you'd think would be a bigger part of the game world, but it's not. It's mentioned offhand in his reports every so often, but otherwise it's barely mentioned. Now, I obviously haven't heard every single line of dialogue in the game, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong here, but as far as I know, I don't think anyone else in the game mentions the good fight at all. No one mocking it, no one supporting it, no one taking lessons from Three Dog and actively trying to spread the good fight in a pay-it-forward sort of manner. Nothing I've seen one way or the other. Even if there is a character that mentions it in some way, I haven't seen it in relation to any of the quests at all. So by and large, it's something that the rest of the game world barely acknowledges at all. The good fight could have been yet another interesting aspect to explore if it were developed more. Have factions for and against it, build up conflicts, turn Three Dog into this major lore character who requires protection due to his influence. Have quest characters embrace the idea if you help them. It's just another instance of lost potential and something that never got fully developed in a sea of lost potential. Now, it's not all entirely bad. I do actually really like the idea of Tranquility Lane. I just wish there was more to it, and I wish the choice wasn't so black and white. As explained way earlier in the video, Tranquility Lane is a simulation in which Dr. Braun has complete control of, including the memories, life, and death of its residents, and with this power he uses it to torment them for his own entertainment. However, he erases their memories of the torment, and there's also a failsafe, which results in the death of all permanent residents besides Braun himself. There's a chance here to have some gray morality in regards to the question of life and death, but the writers cut this chance off at the knees with Old Lady Dithers, and just in general not expanding this section of the game. This woman comes up to you when she realizes you're new to the simulation, and she tells you Betty is actually Braun, and she knows they're all in a simulation. She wants you to activate the failsafe to end the nightmare that the simulation has become. She's fully aware of what's going on, including Braun's cruelty. This means one of two things. Either the simulation is breaking down for one reason or another, such as equipment in the real world deteriorating, for example, which in turn affects certain functions within the simulation, or the simulation itself was flawed from the outset. Regardless, the result is the memory wipe being flawed, at the very least, for Old Lady Dithers, and possibly for more residents in the future, which means they face an eternity of suffering with no possible escape. In fact, that's already the fate they're stuck with. Most of them just don't know about it because of the memory wipe. Is terror, misery, suffering, and death a bad thing to go through for eternity if you keep getting reset and don't know it ever happened? Is a real and permanent death a better solution? It's certainly an interesting question, but it's handled in such a way that makes it clear that the objectively good option is activating the failsafe and having everyone permanently killed, due to the fact the memory wipe is faulty and Dithers remembers what happens. This isn't even taking into account the fact that Braun might just stop giving a shit and disable the memory wipe, should he so choose, and enjoy the suffering of the residents constantly in fear of what he'll do to them next. If you activate the failsafe, Braun is the only survivor, trapped alone in the simulation forever, which is almost treated as just desserts for him. He wielded the power of the simulation to make people suffer for 200 years, only to become powerless and alone for the rest of eternity, or until whenever the equipment breaks down and fails to keep his physical body alive anymore. Tranquility Lane ends up falling short due to it being a rather small section of the game already, but also not exploring these ideas and concepts more. It's actually rather unfortunate, as it ends up being one of the more interesting segments in the game, because it's one of the extreme few that is not only based in what could have been gray morality, but also for the fact that it's one of the few segments of the game that isn't totally based around shooting nameless enemies, and largely has you interacting with characters and figuring out solutions to objectives. Now, this might be something of a bold statement to start this segment of the discussion, but Fallout 3 is lacking in content, at least when it comes to questing. Since Morrowind to present day with Fallout 4, out of all the games Bethesda has developed, Fallout 3 has the least amount of named quests. While I will be comparing direct numbers in just a moment, I want to make it clear that I'm not implying that quantity is more important than quality. However, Fallout 3's quests largely fail in the quality department too, and I'll be going over each and every one of them shortly, aside from the main story, which I've obviously already covered. I also want to define the terms really quickly. By named quests, I'm referring to quests that show up in the quest log of these games. I'm not referring to unmarked quests, which do have their own names in the editor, but the player never sees those names. I'm also ignoring repeatable quests. The reason for this is rather simple. Generally speaking, unmarked quests are typically very generic, simple in nature, and objective, or they're meant to account for variables or specific actions in the game world, and repeatable quests are largely the same, except you could do them infinitely, such as giving scrap metal to Walter and Megaton. They're generally not full-on quests, but small and mostly insignificant tasks available to the player. With that out of the way, Fallout 3 has a grand total of 17 side quests, or technically 18 if you count Rescue from Paradise, which might be mandatory as part of the main quest. For the sake of argument, let's just go with 18. Those quests are Agatha's Song, Big Trouble in Big Town, Blood Ties, Head of State, Oasis, Riley's Rangers, Stealing Independence, Strictly Business, Tenpenny Tower, the Nuka-Cola Challenge, The Power of the Atom, The Replicated Man, Rescue from Paradise, The Superhuman Gambit, The Wasteland Survival Guide, Those, Trouble on the Home Front, and You Gotta Shoot 'Em in the Head. Comparatively, this is an insanely low amount of quests to other Bethesda titles. There's a tutorial segment, the main quest, and these 18 side quests. There aren't any joinable factions or side quest lines. This is it. This is all of the major content in the game. Now for these comparisons, I'll ignore the main story and focus on all the side content, based on what I could find in the relevant wikis. I'm going to start with Morrowind, which is a bit tricky in the sense that it doesn't really have any unmarked quests, as most tasks or events update your journal automatically anyways. In Morrowind, the Fighters Guild has 31 quests, the Mages Guild has 33 quests, the Thieves Guild has 23 quests, or technically 30 if you count the Bal Mologmer quests. The Tribunal Temple has 23 quests, the Morag Tong have 25 quests, the Imperial Cult has 25 quests, the Imperial Legion has 19 quests, House Redoran has 36 quests, House Halalu has 31 quests, House Telvanni has 28 quests, there's 7 Daedra quests, there's 14 quests related to vampires, and finally, there's 69 side quests, for a grand total of 371 quests that are unrelated to the main story. Now I should make clear, this is definitely quantity over quality. There's certainly a lot of great quests in Morrowind, but there's also a lot of overly simple ones, such as the Morag Tong quests, most of which are just for you to kill an NPC with no additional instructions, as they're the Assassin's Guild of this game, and the programmers didn't really have the ability to make them as complex as the ones in Oblivion and Skyrim. Hell, they can't even get NPCs to travel from location to location in Morrowind. Next is Oblivion, which has 19 Fighters Guild quests, 20 Mages Guild quests, 12 Thieves Guild quests, 21 Dark Brotherhood quests, the Arena has 2 quests, there's 15 Daedra quests, and 48 side quests, for a total of 137 quests that are unrelated to the main story. I also trimmed this list down a bit as there's quests listed that don't seem like full-on quests, such as joining or being expelled from factions, or finding master skill trainers. Next is New Vegas. While it was developed by Obsidian, it's still the same type of game as these other Bethesda titles. Now the New Vegas main story is different for the fact there are different factions you can join. I will still be ignoring it in favor of discussing what's considered by the wiki to be side content, and by my count there's a grand total of 80 side quests there, and this is not counting unmarked quests. Though even if I did, it would still blow Fallout 3 out of the water in that regard. Next up is Skyrim, which has 28 quests for the Dark Brotherhood, the College of Winterhold has 15 quests, the Companions have 8 quests, the Thieves Guild has 18 quests, the Blades have 1 quest, the Bard's College has 4 quests, The Civil War has 27 quests, there are 16 Daedra quests, and 53 side quests, for a total of 170 quests unrelated to the main story. This number might be a bit off because the wiki is a bit disorganized in how they label each quest, and I made an effort to ignore the miscellaneous, repeatable, and Radiant quests, but some Radiant quests were mixed in with regular quests. Finally is Fallout 4, which has 35 side quests, again ignoring miscellaneous, repeatable, and Radiant quests. Now again, more quests doesn't necessarily mean they're better designed, but it's absolutely worth mentioning that Fallout 3 is vastly lacking in content as compared to its peers. The worst part is, most of these quests aren't even that great, though they're still leagues better than Fallout 4's quests. I would certainly be more forgiving of the lack of quests if they were better designed overall. I'd far prefer to have a game with 20 quests with the quality of GI Blues or Come Fly With Me than 500 quests with the quality of Order Up or Kid in a Fridge. Unfortunately, here we get neither. Instead, we get a few quests that range from total fucking garbage to middling and mediocre, with a couple real gems that are fairly well designed. Power of the Atom. You had to know I was going to start here. Power of the Atom is likely one of the earliest side quests you will get in Fallout 3. Upon reaching Megaton, Lucas Sims will talk to you, and you have a chance to ask him about the bomb. Hilariously enough, you could even ask why people would build around a bomb because that's fucking insane, and his reasoning is the town didn't spring up overnight. People who were denied entry to Vault 101 kept coming back here to meet up, which is ridiculous and still doesn't explain away the fact that it's fucking madness to build a town around a nuke. The fact Mr. Burke even wants to set off the bomb to wipe out the town should highlight how fucking stupid this is. Anyways, you can offer to disarm the bomb for Lucas Sims. On the other side of this issue is Mr. Burke, who wants you to detonate the bomb. He explains that Megaton and its people are essentially a stain upon the wasteland, but he doesn't elaborate what that even means or how they're any different from any other settlement. He just thinks they deserve to be blown up and wiped off the map. Already we're running into issues. This is very likely to be the first side quest you're given, and right away you're given the most extreme possible option of any of the Fallout games ever had. The option to just nuke a town with barely any reasoning or motivation for why characters want this to happen. There's no build-up or conflict or tension, there isn't factions at odds with one another, it's not a grey morality situation, it's not the culmination of a long quest line, it doesn't present any deep ideas of good versus evil. It's just a straight-up simple quest to either nuke a town for no good reason or disarm the bomb. It's pure black and white morality. Tenpenny says there was an eyesore seeing it on the horizon, but Megaton is completely out of sight from Tenpenny Tower. There's a freeway that completely obscures any view of it you would have from Tenpenny Tower. Regardless of your choice, you get player housing, either a crap shack in Megaton or a penthouse suite in Tenpenny Tower, and additionally you get some caps. These are also the only two choices in regards to blowing up the bomb. You do have the option of reporting Mr. Burke to Lucas Sims, but this results in one of the most idiotic sequences in the entire game. Sims places Burke under arrest, despite not having any kind of jail in town, and begins to take him away to God knows where. Now I want to stop here for a moment and ask, what would you do in this situation if you lived in the world of Fallout and you had to arrest Mr. Burke? You'd probably restrain him somehow, search him for weapons, basically prevent him from being any kind of threat to you, right? Well, Lucas Sims is a smart character, so of course he's going to handle the situation well, right? Nope. His master fucking plan is putting away his weapon and turning his back on Burke without restraining him or searching him for weapons of any kind. Burke then shoots Sims in the back, killing him. Lucas Sims is supposed to be a smart lore character. He's the sheriff of town. He cares about law and order. He's also the mayor of town. And yet, he makes one of the most stupid fucking decisions possible. This man wants to literally nuke Megaton, killing everyone in town. And Lucas Sims rushes to arrest him, weapon drawn, and the moment he enters Moriarty's, his brain just ceases to function and he turns his back on a fucking psycho that wants to nuke a town for shits and giggles. It's also very strange that if you were to kill Lucas Sims, the entire town would turn hostile. But Burke publicly murders him and no one gives a shit. They all just let him walk. And before anyone makes any dumbass fucking comments, I'm not saying you should be able to murder Lucas Sims with no repercussions. I'm saying it's ridiculous that no one else attempts to stop Burke or kill him or anything. Now, in the original Fallout games, as well as New Vegas, you would get end slides based on your actions throughout the game. Not just in relation to the main story, these end slides would include a narration detailing what impact your choices and actions had upon the world after the end of the game. Fallout 3 almost lacks this entirely. As mentioned earlier, there are 3 end slideshows based purely on your karma: good, neutral, and evil. And the only choice that's accounted for in the ending is whether you poison the water or not. However, there are a couple slides that do appear based on what you do in quests, but they have absolutely no narration. For example, if you were to nuke Megaton, there would be an end slide showing the mushroom cloud, with only the soundtrack playing. This is absolutely fucking useless to the player in terms of showing what they did. They already saw the town get blown up. Is throwing a filter on that image during the end of the game supposed to make it poignant? It has far less impact than explicitly telling the player the long-term ramifications of their actions. The example I like to use is Necropolis from Fallout 1. If you fail to repair their water pump, you get this end slide.
The ghouls of Necropolis learn firsthand the final meaning of dehydration as their city succumbs to the desert sands and the water runs out. Without their water purifying control chip, they do not survive.
With Fallout 4, I blame it on laziness that all they have is a generic cutscene ending that doesn't take anything into consideration besides whether you join the Institute or not, as well as the fact there's next to no choices in their quests anyways. It ends up feeling more like a formality than something they actually wanted to do. But with Fallout 3, I can only assume it's an extension of the lack of world building. They can't detail the long-lasting ramifications of Megaton's survival or destruction because there's not enough world building to account for either option. Megaton almost seems to exist within a bubble. Its destruction does not affect anyone else in the wasteland in any way. The most you get is rando NPCs saying the town was wiped off the map, with little else to show any kind of impact. When a major town suddenly ceases to exist, you'd think there would be more widespread consequences than nothing at all. Fallout 2 has an end slide explaining what happens if you destroy the Gecko power plant.
The Gecko reactor meltdown had terrible consequences for the region. The resultant radioactivity and heat emanating from the reactor killed every living creature within a 10-kilometer radius and poisoned the area for years to come. Vault City's perceived threat from the peaceful ghouls of Gecko was at an end.
And what does Megaton get? Yeah, big fucking difference there. Imagine how impactful it would be if nuking Megaton actually had consequences upon the world, besides the town simply ceasing to exist. This is something I've discussed in other videos, but imagine if Megaton produced an important commodity, such as medicine, or, food. With the loss of this major location, you now lose the source of this resource. Now, all other settlements that require this resource would be in trouble. They would need to find some other way of acquiring medicine or food, by either finding a way to make their own, trading with a different group that might be more costly, or have less quality, or in a worst case scenario, this could result in towns waging war on each other for their resources. It goes a long way to show there's more to the world, that these locations and characters have significance beyond what is directly important to the player. As mentioned at the beginning of this segment too, there's no build up to this. You walk into a bar as part of the main quest, a guy waves you over and literally says, "Hey kid, wanna nuke this shithole?" Such an extreme and significant event should at least have a bit of build-up and reasoning to exist. While I don't doubt that psychos exist out there who would want to see this happen for pure shits and giggles, it's not really a compelling reason to nuke the town as far as the narrative goes. It would have been more interesting if this was the culmination of a long questline dealing with the conflict between Megaton and some other settlement or group. It would be a literal nuclear option to end the conflict in the worst way possible. It could be designed in such a way where it isn't a pure binary black and white good versus evil choice. The final thing I want to note about this quest is the fact that 3Dog calls Tenpenny a land grabber, as if he's some kind of real estate baron, but all he's got to his name is his tower? Worse yet, 3Dog goes on to say that Tenpenny had been looking to secure the spot Megaton is in for years. What the fuck does that even mean? There's an entire empty wasteland of literal free real estate. Why does Tenpenny want that one spot in particular, and why does he think nuking it will allow him to have it? If anything, that would only make the area uninhabitable for decades at minimum, and judging from his age, Tenpenny ain't gonna last that long. Once again, this is something that could have been fleshed out and developed more. In fact, it could have been the entire conflict between Megaton that leads to the option of nuking it. It could be a scenario where Tenpenny wants to force them out, but they refuse to leave and the conflict escalates. It pushes him to the point of demanding the city be destroyed in a petty, if I can't have it, no one can kind of way. I'm sure something interesting could have come from this, but no, we get fucking nothing. Tenpenny Tower. This quest is often argued to be one of the better quests in the game, and after playing it again recently, I disagree. Tenpenny Tower has a ghoul problem. Roy Phillips and his friends want to live in the tower, and the people inside don't want them there. That's a fairly black and white case of racism. All of the anti-ghoul people say some pretty nasty things in regards to the situation. Roy and his friends have the caps, at least according to Roy himself, so there's no real reason why they can't be allowed in, besides the fact that people don't like ghouls. There's 3 ways to solve this quest. First, you can just wipe out Roy and his friends. This is the obvious evil solution. You're killing people who, as far as we know, haven't actually done anything wrong. They just want to live in the tower for some reason, likely because it's well defended or just generally a very nice place in comparison to the rest of the wasteland. On the other hand, if you talk to Roy, you can actually spare him and his friends and help them get into the tower by opening a secret back door and allowing him to release feral ghouls into the tower and slaughtering everyone, no exceptions. This includes other innocent people such as Herbert Dashwood. So the 2 primary options for dealing with this quest are both downright evil. There isn't really any option to be a good guy or to solve this quest peacefully. Well, there is a third option in which you can convince Tenpenny to allow the ghouls to live there, though this results in having to kick out several NPCs that hate ghouls and absolutely refuse to live with them, which you can do. So everything is solved without costing any innocent life, and the remaining humans seem to like the ghouls and are at least open to living with them. Pretty awesome, right? Well, no. If you return in a few days later, all the humans are mysteriously gone. The tower is only inhabited by ghouls now. You'll find the dead bodies of all the innocent human residents in a broom closet. The ghouls just slaughtered them all anyways. This happens even if you do kill Roy after telling him they can live there, so you can't attain the peaceful ending without the humans dying. It's a subversion of the typical scenario where a peaceful solution can be found and everyone lives in harmony. I've seen it referenced quite often that this is actually a good thing, and it has grey morality, but it ends up feeling like a cheap shot on Bethesda's part. Your only options are 2 evil genocides of mostly innocent groups, and a false peaceful solution that results in people dying, and you have no way of knowing it will happen. So it can be really off-putting to go through the effort of attaining the peaceful ending, only to have all these characters die anyways. Why go through the effort of kicking out the 5 NPCs to attain the peaceful solution, if everyone is just gonna fucking die anyways? If you have no way of knowing Roy will murder everyone, then how is it grey morality? Unless the argument for grey morality is the fact that both groups will wipe each other out in both of the violent solutions to this quest. But I'm not sure that's morally grey. The slaughter of innocents on either side seems evil regardless, and I wouldn't necessarily consider blatantly evil option versus blatantly evil option to be morally grey. In terms of lives lost, the obvious solution is to kill Roy and his group, as it's only 3 deaths, as opposed to the dozen or so in Tenpenny Tower. It's also worth mentioning that Roy Phillips is a good karma character, according to the game itself, which is really fucking weird considering how much of an evil piece of shit he is. Ultimately with this quest, the only winning move is to not play. Blood Ties. It's a bit tricky to talk about this quest, because half of it is really good, and half of it is incredibly fucking retarded. But the problem isn't as simple as the first portion being good and the second portion being bad, or vice versa. The problem is the good is mixed with the bad. This quest can start in 2 ways, either from Lucy West and Megaton, asking you to deliver a message to her family in Arafu, or by approaching Arafu independently. Upon arriving, you'll nearly be killed by Evan King, an old man who is apparently the only one who gives enough of a damn to try to defend the town. He explains they're being harassed by a group of thugs known as the Family, and in their last raid the family wiped out all of Arafu's Brahmin. King asks you to check up on the residents of Arafu. You learn that Ewers and Shenzi are fine, but the Wests have been killed. The Ewer woman is a mental case who believes you're a mailman, delivering a fall catalog. No idea how anyone can even have such a delusion 200 years after the war. Most people wouldn't even know what a catalog is, but here we are. She also gives you chocolate chip cookies later, which end up being useless tin cans added to your inventory. It's Fallout, so it's supposed to be quirky. No, this character is fucking stupid, and is yet another example of Bethesda doing stupid shit with this franchise. And while it's an incredibly minor issue compared to everything else, I'm still calling it the fuck out. This is stupid, Bethesda. Fuck off! Anyways, upon finding the bodies of the Wests, you can examine them, and there's actually one of the few skill checks in the entire game here. Amazing, I know. If only there were more in the game as a whole. I could point to it as having some good options. But unfortunately, we only get a few bare scraps. There's several stages to the skill check too, as you get no info if your skill is too low. You can learn they have bite marks on their necks with minimal skill, and further skill check reveals there's little blood on them, and an even higher medical skill reveals the bite marker from human teeth, and a final skill check tells you there's train yard residue on their bodies. Okay. That last one seems like a bit of a stretch to me. I'm not a medical expert, but I get the impression that train yard residue isn't a common medical condition, or is dealt with often in being a doctor. This also makes no sense given what we learn in a bit, but I'll get to that shortly. Reporting back to Evan King, he assumes the family did it, but he doesn't know where they are. The West's son Ian is also missing, and you're tasked with rescuing him. King marks a few locations where they could be, but they're all wrong. However, if your medicine skill is high enough to learn about the train residue, he sends you to the correct location. Upon meeting the family, you're directed to talk to their leader, Vance, and he explains they're a coven of vampires. Yep, vampires. In a Fallout game. Now granted, they aren't literal vampires, they're just LARPing as them. Why the fuck is LARPing such a common theme in this game? They're actually cannibals who reject eating flesh in favor of drinking blood. Or in other words, Bethesda decided to tack more stupid gimmicky bullshit into a game full of stupid gimmicky bullshit, with no care for how or why it worked. There's so many issues with this. Okay, first and foremost, humans cannot survive on drinking blood. That's just fucking retarded. Worse still is the fact that drinking blood is actually incredibly dangerous. Like, it's fine if you bit your lip and bleed a little, or if you accidentally cut your finger and suck on the wound, or whatever the fuck people do. But actually drinking large quantities of blood, what's assumed to be necessary to survive in this scenario, would actually be toxic and cause a variety of issues, diseases, and even death. But it's a science fiction game. You're not supposed to compare it to reality. Sometimes the limits of science are stretched to provide interesting stories in fiction. Yeah, that's true. But the world of Fallout is still largely based on our own world. Stretching some rules for the sake of interesting stories doesn't mean throwing them out the window entirely. The writers at Bethesda made a fundamental change to how the world of Fallout works, all for the sake of a dumb gimmicky quest that would have been far more suited to be in an Elder Scrolls game than a Fallout game. And this could have been a really awesome quest if done in Elder Scrolls. The family may not be actual vampires, but they're still an absurd and ridiculous group that should not exist. Also, consider the fact that Vance even says he survived off of old blood packs in the ruins of hospitals. You know, the hospitals that have been in ruins for 200 years? Donated blood and blood packs have a shelf life of just 6 weeks, yet this fucker was drinking 200-year-old blood to survive. It's fucking ridiculous. So the family has Ian West, and it turns out he's a cannibal too. And they're trying to make him join their little group of dipshits. They describe the hunger as if it's some kind of innate condition these people have, and its hunger caused Ian to kill his parents. This shit spawns several more issues. This implies the hunger is so bad it caused him to murder his own parents, which makes it seem as though he has legitimate mental issues than just having a craving for human flesh. He also drank their blood, which kind of contradicts the whole cannibal thing. The family are taking him in so he doesn't become a cannibal. But it seems as though he technically wasn't already, since he didn't eat his parents. It's mentioned that Ian talked to Vance prior to this happening, so some people might argue he was influenced to drink blood rather than eat flesh, But if you're in enough of a frenzy to kill your parents, I don't think that level of cognition is necessarily possible. He also went for the neck in both cases too. That's how they both died. No gunshots or stabbings or beatings. He somehow managed to kill both of them by chomping on their necks and sucking all their blood out. Okay, so if it's Ian that killed them, then why the fuck is there train yard residue on their bodies? Ian talked to Vance. He didn't go off frolicking to the train yard with him before killing his parents. I suppose the implication is that the members of the family checked the West's corpses, but I mean, mate, they're fucking dead. They also scrawled the family on the wall in blood for some reason. What the fuck are they doing? There's several ways to solve this quest. First of all, you can convince Ian to either stay with the family or return home. Neither has any ramifications or long-term consequences. It's implied the family will help him with his issues, but it's also implied he can handle it on his own, due to it literally never being an issue ever again, which kind of begs the question of why it was an issue for him in the first place. Either way, that's really it as far as Ian is concerned. The other aspect to solve is the family. Now, my favorite approach to this quest is just wiping out the family because goddamn do I hate these stupid fucking characters. But you have to do this before talking to Ian, otherwise Arfu will also turn hostile for some reason. Even though the family has been harassing them and they should want this, and they should also not even know if you killed them or not already. You can also ask Vance to stop attacking Arfu and he'll agree, just like that. You can also pass a speech check or a skill check to convince Vance to instead enter an agreement with Arfu, where the family will defend the town in exchange for blood donations, which is the optimal solution for all parties. Oh yeah, their Brahmin will also respawn, so there's that, I guess. I do find it strange how Vance acts like his little group of brain-dead fucking cunts are misunderstood, and yet they absolutely are thugs who attack the town of Arfu. Overall, this quest does a few things right by having skill checks and a number of end options that actually make sense given the scenario, but also does incredibly stupid shit as well with its ridiculous groups, characters, and overall story. Fuck this stupid fucking quest. The Superhuman Gambit. Thankfully, there's far less to say about this ridiculous quest. Upon reaching Canterbury Commons, you will find two characters dressed up like a supervillain and a superhero. The former, known as the Ant Agonizer, is in control of giant ants, and the latter, the Mechanist, is in control of robots. They do dumb hammy cartoon speeches before sending their minions to fight each other, then they both run off because... reasons, I guess. The story is that Ant Agonizer showed up in town one day and started causing havoc. Kinda. The town's mechanic used some robots to defend the place from her, and she couldn't really do much against them. But one day she managed to kill one of the robots, and I guess this made the mechanic go insane. He started dressing up as the Mechanist, and started having these little showdowns with her. And it's just really fucking stupid. I highlight this as one of the more extreme examples of Bethesda shoving stupid gimmicky bullshit into their Fallout games. Like, both these characters have these backstories to explain why they've taken up these personas, but it appears as though they never actually do anything besides have a daily scuffle, because it's told in no uncertain terms through both NPCs in Canterbury, as well as Three Dogs broadcasts, that this has been ongoing for quite a while. When I recorded footage for this quest, the robots killed the giant ants, but once the fight was over, they both ran off. It's not a fucking stalemate, the Mechanist won a decisive victory. If he wants to destroy her because she killed his robot or whatever, then why doesn't he just finish the fucking job? It seems as though these characters would just be in a perpetual conflict and never accomplish anything, because they refuse to take any further action against each other besides having these small scuffles between their minions in the street. I remind you, this is happening in a world where food doesn't exist and water is a dire issue, and these characters just somehow don't have to worry about these vital resources at all. There are several ways to solve this quest. You could kill either of them and present their costume to the other. You could kill both of them. You could talk them down with certain perks or passing a speech check, or you can help one defeat the other, which conveniently results in the one you're going to kill showing up in the base of the one you teamed up with. It's worth noting that entertaining their delusions results in bad karma too. Instead of all that, though, you could just choose the vastly superior option and just never fucking visit Canterbury Commons, and never have to deal with this stupid fucking quest or its characters. The Replicated Man. This is actually one of the slightly better quests in the game due to the fact there isn't a quest marker that leads you to every objective, but that's still not saying a whole lot. It seems as though this quest was supposed to be a sort of investigation across the wasteland in order to find this missing android, but that doesn't really work when you can find most of the information you need in a single town. There's a couple ways to obtain this quest, but the most likely is if you grab random holotapes in the world. There's a few in most major locations, such as Megaton having at least 3, maybe more, as well as Tenpenny Tower, Paradise Falls, Rivet City, and so forth, all having holotapes that relate to this quest. However, if you happen to miss all those holotapes, you can also run into this quest by just doing the main story, as Dr. Zimmer just so happens to be in a location that is mandatory to visit during the main story. Anyways, upon picking one of the holotapes up, this obnoxious bitch will track you down like the fucking Terminator and get all up in your face screeching at you like a fucking blue hair as if you're hell-bent on finding out who this android is, when all you did was pick up a fucking holotape and didn't even look at it in the Pip-Boy. This would make more sense if you had actually been asking around first, but no. This happens just for picking up one of the holotapes related to this quest. Anyways, if you listen to the tapes, you'd think there was a manhunt spanning the entire wasteland for this synth. The slavers are apparently being paid big money to hunt him down, but this is never shown happening in the world. Why not have it so there are bounty hunter type characters in the world who are looking for this synth? You could have one in Megaton asking around. He could be in some kind of argument with Moira or the town's doctor or someone, and this could open up to the possibility of actually receiving the quest from him. But no, this is apparently a huge search that's going on that's never shown. It's like how there's apparently a civil war going on in Skyrim, but it's barely portrayed. After collecting the holotapes, you can question NPCs they may be related to, such as doctors or people who are skilled with tech, to see what they know and what leads they can give. You can also bring this info to Zimmer. Eventually you learn that a man named Pinkerton might be a key figure in this mystery, and upon finding him in the abandoned broken off half of Rivet City, he'll give you the information you need. The synth is actually Harkness. You know, the obnoxious asshole who questions you the moment you arrive in Rivet City. Turns out he had his face changed and memories wiped to avoid being tracked down by Zimmer. Now finding all that information out is only necessary for fully completing this quest. You could get a far more simple solution earlier on, if you take the synth component from the obnoxious cunt and give it to Zimmer. The quest will simply end there. However, if you continue through the full quest, 2 additional endings open up to you. First, you can reveal to Harkness who he is and restore his memories, at which point he wants to kill Zimmer, or alternatively, you can do it for him. The other ending is revealing to Zimmer who Harkness is, which will cause him to locate Harkness, reset him, and take him home. Hilariously enough, though, you can get the unique rewards from both endings, and if you allow Zimmer to take Harkness away in that instance, he won't even fight back. You know, instead of killing Zimmer on sight, he instead listens to what he has to say, even though his memories have been restored, and he should know how fucking dangerous it is to be talking to Zimmer. Overall, it seems like they tried to do something interesting with this quest, and they deserve credit for that. I just don't think it was handled particularly well. I'd also give them credit for not leaning so hard on the map marker and expecting players to figure out things for themselves, but that's likely a byproduct of the fact there's so many NPCs that could potentially be questioned about evidence related to Harkness, such as every doctor in the game, including the one in Big Town, which makes it seem less like a conscious choice on the part of the developers, and more just the nature of doing a quest with so many potential investigation targets. This also seems to set the tone for a few aspects of Fallout 4 in some ways. It's really uncanny coming back to Fallout 3 and seeing just how obnoxious the railroad is, and how that fits in perfectly with the railroad of Fallout 4. In all honesty, I never completed this quest until I started my analysis of Fallout 4, specifically due to the fact that this cunt is so obnoxious and confrontational for no goddamn reason. Finally, this quest is quite obviously a reference to Blade Runner, and this eventually leads to everything to do with the Institute in Fallout 4. It's unfortunate that a reference to such a great movie leads to such a shitty reference and story. Blade Runner deserves better than to be associated with this putrid garbage. Oasis. This is the only location in the entire game that I'm aware of that has any plant life that is actively growing, and not just burned and dead. Upon approaching the location, you'll be called over by one of the people settled here, and once you properly engage him in dialogue, you'll learn he's a complete fucking whack job, and wants you to meet his god. Or technically his god wants to meet you. They have you do enough drugs until you pass the fuck out, then they drag your unconscious body into the grove where their god is. As it turns out, their god is Harold. Yeah, remember Harold from Fallout 1 and 2? Well, he too traveled across the entire fucking country, just like the Enclave and the Brotherhood. Shit, I'm beginning to wonder why the NCR isn't out here. So now that we can talk to Harold, he explains his problem. He's rooted to the ground permanently, thanks to Bob, which is a tree growing out of his head. He's also surrounded by all these insane whack jobs who all drive him crazy. Harold asks you to kill him, to put him out of his misery. He can't do anything. He can't really talk to anyone because they're all nuts. He's got nothing. It's a concern of the lone wanderer that the tree minders will retaliate for killing Harold, but Harold says he'll talk to them and make them understand. But if it was that easy, why didn't he do so over the many years he's been trapped here? He's made it clear he's tried making them understand before, but they haven't, so why would now be any different? Oh wait, the player is involved and they need a way for the player to peacefully leave for granting Harold's wish. Just don't think about it too much. Harold explains that due to Bob's growth, his organs have been pushed elsewhere. Whatever the fuck that means. Apparently his heart is down in a fucking cave system. Don't even know how that's possible. On your way to the caves, you're stopped by the king and queen of the asylum. One of them wants you to apply an ointment that suppresses plant growth, and the other gives you one that increases plant growth. Birch wants the growth to be slowed, because he fears it'll attract the attention of people in the wasteland, including those that would harm Harold and the living plant life they have in Oasis. His wife, on the other hand, believes that the growth should be encouraged, as new plant life in the wasteland could save it, and the tree minders shouldn't be hoarding it all to themselves. On the surface, this quest comes off as a genuine question of whether or not it's right to end Harold's suffering. On one hand, it's obviously a nightmare for Harold. He's permanently stuck in place. He can't do anything. He has no one to talk to besides these whackjaws. And he's only got one single view. He can't even have a change of scenery. On the other hand, he's responsible for the only living plant life in the entire wasteland, which can either be protected in this one location or spread across the wasteland. Either way, his followers seem to rely on him as well. But regardless of which way this plays out, it ends up cutting the legs out from this moral dilemma. If you kill Harold, Father Birch will say he talked to Harold and finally understood, and that it's a shame they didn't realize sooner to make things easier for him. However, if you let him live by doing either of the two other options, Harold will say he could give the nutjobs another chance, which implies there's no downside to allowing him to live, that he won't be suffering. If he convinced Birch in the scenario in which you kill him, it stands to reason he convinced Birch in the scenario in which you don't kill him. Additionally, you have the option to burn Harold, but strangely enough, this is absolutely impossible unless you actually talk to him about it first. Maybe my game was just bugging out, but I tried burning him a few times, and only after he said burning is not the way he wants to go does it become an available option. Burning is the evil option here, and it will turn all the tree minders hostile. These insane fucks also wear robes with a bunch of loose sticks and branches sticking out of them, and it looks incredibly uncomfortable. It just makes them look that much more ridiculous. Now I know I keep bringing up the end slides, but I feel it's necessary to repeat. Besides the issue with the character dialogue implying letting Harold live is a good option, this quest could really benefit from having proper end slides. There's some decent choice here in terms of what can happen for the future of Oasis and the Wasteland. You could have slides detailing how spreading plant growth absolutely helped the Wasteland, or how it attracted the attention of people who would destroy it. You could have end slides detailing how suppressing plant growth caused Oasis to stagnate in terms of people willing to take care of Harold and the plants, and eventually the tree minders die out and Harold was left all alone, or how doing so protected the plants from being destroyed. You could have an end slide telling about how burning Harold caused all of Oasis to burn down, being condemned to just another ruin in the wasteland devoid of life. There's 5 potential ideas that could have worked for impactful end slides for your choices. You gotta shoot him in the head. There's honestly not a whole lot I have to say about this quest. Mr. Crowley in Underworld hires you to kill people he deems to be ghoul-hating bigots, though his real goal is to get their keys to Fort Constantine, except Tenpenny, who he legitimately wants dead. You can get their keys through a speech check by stealing it, or just by killing them and taking it. However, he'll pay 100 caps for killing each of the targets with a shot to the head. Once he has all the keys, the quest will end, and he will travel to Fort Constantine and take the T-51B power armor set that's there. Alternatively, you could take the armor for yourself, and he'll angrily say you stole what was rightfully his. One thing to note was that the job they were originally hired for was 20 years ago, and yet the fully intact corpse of a member of their team is still there. It seems to be a running issue with Bethesda for not having corpses decay, even though they should have. It's also worth mentioning that you can betray Mr. Crowley to Tenpenny, who will pay you in return for killing Crowley. However, you could get part of the payment up front and double-cross Tenpenny too, and continue working for Crowley. Trouble on the home front. After the Enclave takes over Project Purity, this quest becomes available. I mentioned this earlier and I want to bring it up again, but I do like the idea of more quests becoming available after certain events happening in the world, or after a set time. This quest is unfortunately the only example of this happening in Fallout 3. This quest is also only available for a limited time as well, the implication likely being that Vault Security raided and defeated the rebels behind the Overseer's back. An emergency broadcast can be heard from Vault 101, with Amada pleading to the player to come back and help them, as the Vault has essentially descended into civil war. There's two factions: those who want to remain in the Vault and keep it sealed, which is mostly comprised of the older characters as well as the Vault security officers, and those who want to open the Vault, which is mostly comprised of the younger characters. The conflict between the two groups comes down to keeping the Vault sealed for the protection of the residents, versus opening it up to trade and I guess socialize with the outside world. There's a number of ways to reach both of the main solutions to this quest. If you want to keep the Vault closed, you can just kill Amada. You can pass a speech check to convince her to stay in the Vault, or you can find evidence that proves the Enclave have demanded entry into the Vault, which the Overseer has denied, which proves there are dangers outside. If you want to open the Vault, you have similar options. You could kill the Overseer, you could pass a speech check to convince him that the Vault will only survive another couple generations due to having a smaller gene pool, and you could show him evidence that security team is planning behind his back to take out the rebels against his orders. If the Overseer was killed in escape, then Alan Mack is the Overseer, and there is no possible way to convince him. He is absolutely required to be killed. This is also the only major impact anything you do in the tutorial sequence has upon the game world, besides some models being loaded or not during this quest. If you convince the Overseer to stand down, he'll run to Amada and step down as Overseer, granting her the position instead. Regardless of outcome, you're told to leave and never return. Even in the scenario in which you get the Vault to open up, it's impossible to ever enter it again. Additionally, there's a third solution to this quest, where you destroy vital equipment in the Vault, which forces everyone to leave, and you can find some of the residents dead in random encounters later on. Overall, I feel like this is a fairly decent quest, and probably the one that feels most like other Fallout games. There's a central conflict between two opposing groups that can be solved with violence or various other means, and neither side is objectively right or wrong. Both sides have valid points. Big Trouble in Big Town. This is another quest I admittedly don't have a whole lot to say about. There's a couple ways to start this quest, either from finding Red, getting it from Big Town itself, or from escorting Sticky from Lamplight to Big Town. Either way, the primary objective is to rescue the town's doctor, Red, as well as the optional objective to rescue Shorty from the super mutants who kidnapped them. The Germantown Police Department is a standard dungeon and not much else. If Red dies, the quest will end the moment you explain her death to the people of Big Town. Shorty is in the basement and he'll be engaged in a conversation with a super mutant, who will eventually begin shooting him, though it's fairly easy to save him. Upon returning to Big Town, the residents fear another super mutant attack and ask for aid for the player, which gives several options, including actual skill checks. 4 of them, in fact. You can personally aid them with the attack and defend the town. You can leave them to their fate, or with a skill of 50 in small guns, sneak, science, or explosives, you could teach them ways to defend themselves by improving their aim with guns, teaching them how to hide from mutants, teaching them how to build and repair robots to defend themselves, and teaching them how to make a minefield as a defense for the town. And there's a final option to tell them the regulators are coming to their aid if you have the Lawbringer perk. There's an additional option of healing Time Bomb in the Big Town Clinic with a medicine skill of 40. Overall, it's a fairly simple and straightforward quest, and there's nothing wrong with that. Not every quest has to be as complex as GI Blues. I've also got to state, once again, that the inclusion of skill checks is certainly a welcome addition, and I wish there were more options like that in the game. I do think it's weird that Big Town continues to be inhabited when they've got two major threats, super mutants and slavers, fucking with them all the time. I don't understand why they can't move elsewhere in the wasteland or why it's so necessary for them to remain here, but at least if you help them, there could have been some kind of interesting follow-up where the town grows and reliably defend itself, though that unfortunately never happens. The Nuka-Cola Challenge. This is probably one of the most stupid quests in the entire game. So this dumb fucking cartoon character somehow managed to amass a collection of Nuka-Cola merchandise in the fucking post-apocalypse. She lives in a world where the lack of food and water are a dire issue that everyone has to deal with and should be a daily concern for everyone, yet she somehow manages to collect all this bullshit. Like, just imagine Mr. Smithers' fucking doll collection, but in the post-apocalypse, and that's how ridiculous this looks. She either had to find all this bullshit herself, or she had to pay someone to do it for her. Not even mentioning having to lug this worthless fucking garbage across the wasteland with all its dangers to her stupid little fucking crap shack. This is once again a town that produces absolutely nothing, like every other fucking town in this game. So how the fuck does she pay for all this, and for the player to collect Nuka-Cola for her? She doesn't do anything, she just wanders around her stupid little shack all day. There's basically nothing to this quest. She wants you to collect 30 Nuka-Cola Quantum for her. That's it. That's the quest. This is something Bethesda thought would be a fun thing for the player to do, and spent time making this dumb fucking character in this dumb fucking quest, instead of more developed or interesting quests, like Trouble on the Home Front or Big Trouble in Big Town. There's an option to sell Quantum to her neighbor instead, who wants to use them to seduce her, and selling them to him grants negative karma because, well, I guess you're helping him manipulate a retard into having sex with him. You can also find a shipping manifest to find where Quantum was delivered, but that was 200 years ago. Luckily, it's all still fucking there. One of the locations is Paradise Falls, which has been populated by slavers for close to a century, and none of them drank this Nuka-Cola. It's all just fucking sitting there. Strictly business. Gross. The gate guard at Paradise Falls wants you to enslave a few specific targets. Red, Flack, Arkansas, and Susan Lancaster. That's it. That's the quest. That's all there is to it. Enslaving one of them might be required for the player to enter Paradise Falls if their karma isn't low enough, or if they fail a speech check to be allowed in. Agatha's Song. Upon meeting Agatha, she can give you a quest to retrieve a special violin from Vault 92. She doesn't know the location, but she tells the player they can gain the location from the Vault Tech headquarters in the DC ruins. That section of this quest is just a dungeon and little more. Vault 92 is also just a dungeon with a quest objective in it and little more. Normally I would have just left it there, but something interesting happens when initially getting this quest. Agatha will mention that if you can find the vault, maybe you can find some kind of record of what happened there, as if she somehow knew it fell into chaos. But as far as I'm aware, the average Wastelander doesn't know that many of the vaults were cruel experiments, and she doesn't seem to mention talking to anyone who's been to the ruins of the vault, so logically she shouldn't know that the vault fell. Yet she regularly speaks as if she knows it for sure. In fact, even the basic premise of this quest becomes a bit weird when you take that into account. She wants you to retrieve the violin from the vault, and the objective is posed as though you're collecting any regular quest item from any regular dungeon. Go collect a satellite dish from the Museum of Technology. Go collect the violin from Vault 92. Instead, she should have been talking about it as though you'd have to convince or bargain for it from whoever owns it now, likely the descendant of her great-great-aunt. Then, upon reaching Vault 92, you realize the horrors that went on inside. Hell, this should have been a shocking revelation to Agatha as well, but it's not even an option to inform her of the fate of the vault or her fucking ancestor. She just takes the violin and that's it. That's the end of it. What a heartless bitch! As for the violin itself, it survived 200 years because it was sealed in a plot device that kept it in pristine condition. It's actually incredibly fucking amazing that it happened to have been sealed in this case, because as we learned in the vault, the experiment was using white noise to drive the residents mad, and it essentially turned them into feral and barbaric psychos killing each other. And the entire vault descended into chaos and everything is a mess. There's traps everywhere, barricades, flooding. It's a fucking miracle that this instrument, the only one required for a quest, is the one single instrument that survived the fall of the vault. The last thing done with it was sealing it in its special case before everyone went mad and murdered each other. The fucking magic case that kept it intact didn't even get damaged. Now some people might respond with, well, how else would the quest end? And I've got an answer for that. Instead, her ancestor's violin should have appeared earlier in the vault, but the case malfunctioned or was destroyed or something. Either way, the original violin is gone. However, this is not the one single instrument case like this in the vault. There are a whole bunch of others in various states from pristine to destroyed in one way or another. Firstly, this allows the collection of additional instruments for other NPCs in the world. But secondly, it allows an alternative option by finding a different violin. The quest can be completed without finding a different violin by reporting back that her ancestors was destroyed. But if you want to fully complete the quest, you have to search further. It's not much, but we've at least added another layer to this quest, and additionally, it would get rid of the absurd convenience of the only surviving instrument being the one that's needed for a quest. Those. Upon approaching the general area of Grey Ditch, Brian Wilkes will approach you begging for help. As it turns out, the settlement is under siege by fire-breathing ants. He will ask you to find his father, who is dead. Searching the nearby shack reveals Dr. Lesko's been doing tests on ants in a nearby dungeon. Deep into the dungeon, you meet Lesko, who has a ridiculous voice. It's like a bad imitation of Professor Frink from The Simpsons. He sounds like a stereotypical crazy nerd character, and I can't take him seriously because of it. There are intelligent scientist characters elsewhere in the game who don't sound like this, but here, for some reason, they decided once again that a dumb fucking cartoon character is the best option to go with. There's a couple ways to solve the quest here. You could kill the Guardian so Lesko can try another FEV treatment on the Queen's eggs. You could kill the Queen and convince Lesko it's the best for humanity. Additionally, you can destroy his FEV sample, and you could just kill Lesko. Hacking the terminal and sending the inhibitor pulse will kill all the fire ants on the surface near Grey Ditch. The final part of this quest is finding Brian Wilkes a home. You can just leave him alone in Grey Ditch. You could sell him as a slave to Paradise Falls. You could send him to Lamplight, or you can have him live with his aunt in Rivet City. What I'm wondering is how the fuck did this dipshit get his hands on fucking FEV to even attempt this? I'd like to remind everyone that FEV is this incredibly rare, top-secret weapon that the military wanted to use to win the war. In this game, Vault-Tec got some for the sake of shoving super mutants into this game. In Fallout 4, the Institute just has FEV and you're not even supposed to think about it. And as I've recently learned, Fallout 76 had West-Tec just straight up fucking dump FEV into a town's water supply nearly 2 years before the fucking bombs dropped. Everyone just has FEV for no reason. At this point, they should just add fucking pre-war high school chemistry stats to Fallout 5 that each contain an FEV sample. I mean, why the fuck not? Everyone else seems to have easy access to this top-secret bioweapon, so it stands to reason it should be as common as fucking dirt at this point. Riley's Rangers. I had only done this quest once before years ago, but I had vague memories of it being more complex than it actually is. About 98% of this quest is doing a dungeon full of enemies. You could collect some ammo for the guys on the roof, and once you reach them, they ask you to go back into the building and collect a fusion battery from a dead robot, which they then use to activate the elevator and escape. For some reason, the way you came is unviable now, so it's required to use the elevator. That's really all there is to this quest. Head of State. The major conflict here is between slavers and escaped slaves. Where did these slaves escape from? I have no idea because no one owns slaves in the capital wasteland besides Paradise Falls, the slave traders. If you side with the slavers, you could sell the location of the Temple of the Union and raid it with the slavers, killing the escaped slaves. Additionally, you could sell artifacts related to Lincoln to the slavers for them to destroy, in order to break the spirits of escaped slaves. Or you could sell them to the slaves to worship. If you side with the slaves, they ask you to make sure the Lincoln Memorial is safe, which requires you to kill the slavers there, and they ask you to find a pre-war picture of the memorial so they can properly restore it. It's worth noting that the Lincoln Memorial is in the middle of the extremely dangerous and mutant-infested DC ruins, which really makes you wonder why the escaped slaves want it to be their new Temple of the Union so badly. I understand the significance of it being a memorial to the guy who fought against slavery, but it seems extremely dangerous for unarmed and unarmored slaves to reach in order to get any sort of help. There's nothing really wrong with their current location, they seem to have things fairly well under control there. When you first approach the Temple of the Union, you'll be asked to come inside, then you'll be locked inside until you agree to side with their cause, which doesn't really make them sympathetic. Actually, it makes them seem like incredible assholes and doesn't help endear you to them. The anti-slavers will hold you against your will unless you do what they say. I don't think they caught the irony. It's also hilarious to point out that Bethesda went so far as to disable fast travel in this location, so you can't just zoom out of there. But as it turns out, you could just jump out a window and not even take fall damage. Another thing to note is that many of the characters in this quest are named after real people. They either served in government with Lincoln, or were involved in the Civil War, which just makes this whole thing feel a bit cheap when you have that knowledge. It makes the conflict feel more artificial. It's always been a pet peeve of mine when a character has a name that is directly related to what they do, or their role in a story, if it's a name they didn't choose themselves. Darth Vader works because it's a name given to him. Dr. Evil works because it's a parody. Cruella de Vil doesn't work because her name is literally Cruel Devil, as if her parents saw the future and knew she was going to be a horrible cunt. Naming your character after the role they fill isn't creative, it's fucking lazy. It's like naming your villain Bad Guy McDouchefuck. I also want to mention that at the Temple of the Union, they say they help slaves but cannot allow them to stay at the temple because they don't have enough food to supply anyone, and I can't help but find that fact a bit mind-blowing. Food is barely a consideration for anyone in the wasteland, as explained in detail already. There's no naturally growing food, so it's kind of hilarious that food is suddenly a concern when it's a convenience for the story. Stealing Independence. The creatively named Abraham Washington hires you to retrieve the Declaration of Independence, in what I can only assume is a lazy reference to National Treasure. Upon reaching the National Archives, another NPC will be there who can assist you in this quest, including opening up a shortcut that significantly reduces the amount of dungeon you have to go through. You fight your way through the dungeon and eventually reach a robot that believes himself to be Button Gwynett. The robot was originally meant to be a part of a reenactment of the signing of the Declaration, but since the bombs dropped, I guess he went crazy due to lazy Bethesda writing, and now thinks he's the actual man, but that anyone coming into the archives are the British invading. There are 4 options for dealing with him: simply killing him, agree to help create a forgery of the document to fool the British, convince Gwynett that you're Thomas Jefferson with a speech check, or you can have him shut down if you've got a certain perk. You can additionally retrieve the Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta for Abraham Washington. It's worth noting that these documents would likely be far more safe if left alone in the National Archives than retrieving them for Abraham and being stored in a derelict ship. Oh yeah, you also get negative karma for killing the robot for some reason. I don't know. Rescue from Paradise. Is it morally gray to mass murder slavers? Nah. This quest is all about rescuing children from the slavers of Paradise Falls, of which you have 3 options. You could do the morally good thing and slaughter all the slavers. Alternatively, you could simply buy the children and free them. And finally, you can help them escape, which is the more complicated plan. You need to reconnect Scroll's terminal to the network, which can be done using a terminal in Eulogy's house. Then you've got to distract the gate guard, 40, or alternatively you can just kill him. Sammy and Scroll will leave at this point, but Penny won't until her friend is saved. Rory is locked in a box, and you need to get the key from 40 or from Eulogy. Once you do this, you can free him and either let him escape on his own, or he could follow you out, though it's quite hard to sneak him out and he's likely to die in the process. If he tries to escape on his own, he'll likely die too. Or you could just tell him that he's on his own, and immediately wait 1 in-game hour and he'll just teleport to Megaton. It doesn't matter much anyways, since he goes on to be entirely irrelevant, and Bethesda barely programmed any lines into him in the case he does escape. He just hangs out in Megaton forever, doing nothing. Anyways, as long as you free him from the box, Penny will agree to leave. Or alternatively, you can convince her to leave him behind. Regardless of how you handle it, you will meet the kids outside and they will give their thanks and return the lamplight. Wasteland Survival Guide. This is without a doubt the longest single quest in the entire game, with the most stages. Unfortunately, most of this quest is fairly simple and boring tasks. The overall design of having many stages and options for completing the quest is something Bethesda should stick to when they eventually make Fallout 4. Ha ha ha. Moira is a brain-dead idiot and an overly obnoxious character who constantly baby talks to the player, making completing this quest incredibly annoying and frustrating. Her goal is to write a book for surviving in the wasteland. There's 3 chapters total, each of which have 3 primary objectives, and each of those have an additional optional objective for optimal research. How well you complete each of these objectives determines how good the final book will be, ranging from having nothing but bad information likely to get people killed, all the way up to being an incredibly useful source of information for people to learn from. Additionally, the manner in which you respond to her in each segment of the quest determines what skill boost the book does for you at the end of the quest. Good job, Bethesda! Honestly, besides the relatively boring objectives and the obnoxious cartoon character, there's many aspects of this quest that are really good. I just wish there were more skill-based checks here, instead of simple special checks. In the first chapter of the book, the 3 objectives are food, radiation, and landmines. For food, she sends you to the nearby Super Duper Mart, because of course a grocery store wouldn't be picked clean an entire 200 years after the war. This is the only confirmed food source given for most of the game as well. All you have to do here is find the fridge where the food is stored, and for the bonus objective, the medicine chest in the back room. For radiation, she wants you to get radiation poisoning, which is 200 rads, but the bonus objective is to get 600 rads. That's it. For landmine, she wants you to go to Minefield and reach the playground at the center. The bonus objective is to bring a mine back to her. That's all. Chapter 2 has you deal with a mole rat repellent, planting an observer in a mirelurk nest, and being critically damaged. The first requires you to test for mole rat stick on 3 mole rats, but the bonus objective is to test it on a total of 10. Planting the observer is as simple as running into the Anchorage War Memorial, planting the observer in a clutch of eggs, and leaving. The bonus objective is to not kill any mirelurks. The final objective of Chapter 2 is to return with less than 50% health, and the bonus objective is to have a crippled limb. The final chapter has you dealing with learning Rivet City's history, making use of technology, and accessing information in a library. The first part of this quest is a bit more complicated, as most characters in Rivet City don't seem to know or care. Bannon will claim he helped found this city, but that's a lie. 2 characters can point the player in the right direction, Belle Bonnie and Seagrave Holmes, both of which will point you to Pinkerton and the broken off bow of the ship. Speaking to him reveals the true history of how and why the city was founded. Also, something to note here, part of the reward for this is a 10% discount from the merchants in Rivet City, but Moira just says they'll do it, as if she has any right to speak for them. She doesn't know if they'll give the player a discount, it's just an assumption on her part that happens to be true due to the way the game is coded. In fact, Bannon should specifically refuse such a discount, or even dealing with the player again for revealing the truth. The next part of this quest is dealing with robots and machines. This requires you going to the Robco facility and planting a processor widget in the mainframe. The optional objective is to hack the mainframe. Finally, it's getting information from a library. The terminal you need is immediately in front of you as you enter the building, which gives access to the card catalog. The bonus objective requires doing the whole dungeon to reach a terminal on which you can download the entire library archive. A single holotape can hold the entire media archive of the library. Fucking amazing. Finishing those 3 objectives finishes the quest. Alternatively, you can persuade Moira to just not write the book at all, ending the quest immediately and granting a special perk. Overall, this quest is a mix of some of the best Fallout 3 has to offer with some of the worst. While on one hand, there's plenty of choice in handling your responses to each objective, some of which take special into consideration, and there are wildly different results to the final product based on how well you complete each objective and how you respond to each one. On the other hand, Moira is an incredibly obnoxious and idiotic character, and I have absolutely zero reason to believe she could ever write an effective survival guide, even if she is told all the information she would need. There's a difference between having the factual information and actually parsing it into something the average person can understand, and the game gives no reason to believe Moira is capable of doing so. Additionally, many of the quest objectives are either overly simple or absurd and ridiculous, such as getting damaged or radiation poisoning. Some of the other objectives are little more than doing a dungeon to reach a thing. The intro sequence of New Vegas does a better job of showing players where people get their food and water from, as well as teaching the player how to make medicine, than this quest's interpretation on how to solve these resource needs when the intention of this quest is to help characters survive in the wasteland. Apparently going into a grocery store that's been looted and hasn't received shipment in over 200 years due to the world ending is still totally a viable option for finding food and medicine. Even when I first played this game, when I was in fucking high school and didn't really criticize media too deeply, I realized that this scenario was fucking stupid. One last thing to note on this quest is that Moira survives the destruction of Megaton, likely because this is the single biggest and most detailed quest in the game in terms of objectives to complete and potential outcomes. And finally, we're done with the side quests in this game. I know this is a point I've railed on quite a bit, but I want to bring up the end slides again, because even though I don't think most of these quests are that great, each and every one of them could have a proper end slide of some kind to detail the effects of your actions. Have one that shows how Ian West deals with his hunger, or how Arfu suffers without the family's protection. Have end slides detailing how people survive with the Wasteland Survival Guide, or how it gets them killed due to how awful it was because you didn't complete it properly. Have one that tells about how Agatha's music brought a light of joy to the people of the Wasteland, or selling it to Abraham Washington results in it staying in a display case forever. Big Town becoming known as a ghost town due to how you taught them to sneak, or becoming a fortified compound and known as a secure location in the Wasteland if you helped the residents defend it. How the slaves of the Temple of the Union helped bring an end to slavery in the Wasteland, or how the slavers got more powerful and influential. What Harkness does with his freedom and how he protects Rivet City, or how he's brought back to the Institute and has his memories erased and returned to service, causing more suffering. How the Mechanist and Anti-Agonizer proceed in their lives, whether remaining under their delusions and causing havoc in the world, or returning to normal life or even using their powers for good. Or how about Brian Wilkes being sold into slavery and suffering for it, or growing up without proper guidance in Lamplight, or being left to fend for himself in Grey Ditch, or getting a proper upbringing in Rivet City, and how each of those choices affect his life. How Vault 101 descends into chaos due to civil war, how its residents can be forced out and die off due to being unprepared for the wasteland, how sealing the vault saves them in the short term and damns them in the long term, or how opening the vault helps them prepare for and get used to the outside world, and eventually help rebuilding society. Receiving such endings based on your choices could add so much to this game that simply isn't there. If nothing else, it would help give each of these quests more meaning, because your actions are shown to have long-term consequences for those involved, especially considering your character dies at the end of the game without Broken Steel installed. Your actions would have considerable impact on the Wasteland for decades after your death. Choice and consequence is one of the core foundational aspects of the series, and this game largely treats them as an irrelevant joke. There are times when there's a clear effort to put some choice into dealing with side quests, and there are times where they don't even try. In previous games, choices were more complex and interesting than randomly deciding to nuke a town simply because the option was available to you. As for consequences, they're largely relegated to being shown in random encounters in the world, where seeing the results of your actions comes down to a dice roll, a random draw from a deck of cards, so you might never see the result of your actions. You may run into bounty hunters time and time again, rather than any sort of follow-up to a quest. Many of the actions you take through these quests should have long-lasting ramifications, some of which should impact the world for decades to come, and yet the game treats them as one and done with no more relevance or concern to the world or characters within it. The destruction of Megaton is viewed under the scope of immediate destruction and raw numbers of lives directly lost, not under the implications for the impact it should have for years to come. No one is concerned about the future because it was never a consideration by the developers. The fundamental misunderstanding the developers at Bethesda have of what choice and consequence means is best represented in a leftover comment in the code of Superhuman Gambit. If you kill either of the costume dipshits before actually getting the quest, that's specifically coded that you never get the quest or achievement for it. With the quest designer specifically all caps writing into the code, choice and consequences, punk. As if not getting an Xbox Live or Steam achievement is a consequence anywhere near comparable to the consequences of your actions in the original two games. This seems to be part of a larger Bethesda problem where they're totally non-committal on potential endings and outcomes to situations, where they don't want to confirm anything the player is able to do as being truly canon. The best example of this is the Warp in the West, which is a contrivance invented in Morrowind to explain that all possible endings to Daggerfall were canon due to the laws of causality being suspended and time becoming flexible. They didn't want to settle on one specific outcome being canonically true, so they threw their arms up in the air and said all of them were. Their way of doing this in Fallout is by just not acknowledging any of the choices the player might have made in Fallout 3 in the following game. Fallout 4 has many references to Fallout 3, but none of them involve any sort of quests from Fallout 3, with the exception of the Brotherhood not being destroyed at the end of Broken Steel because Bethesda would never wipe them out anyways. The assumption seems to be that the morally good endings are the canon ones, but this becomes a problem when you account for quests like Strictly Business or Tenpenny Tower, which have no good endings. Rather than writing anything into canon, Bethesda pretends as if it doesn't exist, and rather than having to deal with this pesky problem with Fallout 4's quests, by the time Fallout 5 comes around, they decide to strip choice out for most of the quests anyways, so it's only one ending for most of them, so they won't have to either outright ignore them or struggle to confirm what is or isn't canon in the next game. This is peak laziness as far as creating interesting fictional worlds goes. Just slap a bunch of shit together with no rhyme or reason, no care for how any of it is supposed to work or fit together, and by the time the next release, bank off that nostalgia but otherwise pretend it doesn't exist. Fallout 2 is a direct continuation of the original Fallout, but Fallout 3 disregards that and starts over in a different part of the country. Fallout 4 also takes place miles away from Fallout 3, so there's little to no crossover, except in forced references they seem to think are clever. This only serves to highlight just how much they seem to treat Fallout as an amusement park. There's many attractions and things to do akin to carnival games, and they have just about as much impact on the world, which is to say none at all. Overall, Fallout 3's quests just aren't that great. They're still leagues above Fallout 4's quests, but in many ways they feel like a step down from the quests of the originals. There's some attempt at choice here and there, but oftentimes it doesn't seem to amount to a whole lot, and most areas in the game are one and done, when in the past most towns were quest hubs, or had you dealing with a number of people in each location. So there's a lot less larger categories for me to cover here than in the Fallout 4 analysis, due to the fact that a lot of things that's done in Fallout 4 are more complex or are more worth discussing. So this segment will essentially be a rapid-fire smaller topics that don't warrant a whole segment on their own. I want to start off this segment by saying I do actually really like the general look and feel of most of the world, though it's something I clearly have mixed feelings on overall. On one hand, many of the ruins of the old world look fantastic. Very generally and broadly speaking, I love the designs of many of these buildings and the statues you can find in the world. Like, it generally looks pretty good for, you know, a world that's been nuked to shit and everything is in ruins. And I do like the general atmosphere of the game world, at least if you ignore all the silly shit. It really does feel like a lonely and barren wasteland, so on a first playthrough it can be quite exciting stumbling onto a new town or location, at least until that location reveals itself to be Girder Shade or something equally stupid. It's worth mentioning again that we're 200 years after the war, and there should be a greater semblance of society rebuilding than scattered villages who don't interact with each other. And I find it hard to take any group seriously when they're actively living in rubble and squalor as mentioned earlier. There's no reason for a place like Paradise Falls to look as shitty as it does at this point, when it's been operating for decades. I can even tolerate the various crap shacks of the wasteland, as not everywhere can be Shady Sands or Vault City, but for everyone to be living in a ruin or a crap shack just feels a little lazy. Even New Vegas had most people living in the ruins of the old world, but there seemed to be a general effort to keep things relatively clean in the living spaces of these characters. Many of these issues could be excused if it was maybe only a decade or two after the war. That would honestly fix a lot of issues as far as certain world-building elements go, though it obviously wouldn't fix everything. I also like the addition of Mirelurks to the series. Yep, as far as I could tell, this was a Bethesda invention, with their first appearance being in Fallout 3. I don't know if Black Isle Studios had something similar planned for Van Buren or not, but this is their first appearance in the series. Good job, Bethesda. I think it's proof that Bethesda can do new and interesting things with the series, and I really wish we could see more of the Bethesda that had this creative idea for a new enemy type, rather than the Bethesda that wrote Power of the Atom and Kid in a Fridge, or the Bethesda that feels required to constantly keep reusing aspects from previous games. A fairly common complaint I've seen against this game is the gunplay. Now, I'm not as familiar with this aspect myself, but I'll try to say what I can on this subject. While getting footage for this video, I noticed quite often that my bullets would sometimes stray off in completely random directions. And from what I've heard, this is because accuracy is based on skill more so than the player's own ability to aim, which I'm not really a fan of. If I aim directly at a target and my bullet veers off in some random direction, besides straight out of the barrel of my gun, that just ends up being frustrating and annoying. If they want to have skill impact your ability to use guns, what they should have done instead is have it impact your damage, and let accuracy be determined by the player's ability to aim a gun. Your skill in guns also seems to somewhat affect your aim, as the higher your skill, the more steady you hold your weapon, which is something I do kinda like, but that still doesn't account for bullets veering off in random directions. The guns in this game also lack iron sights for aiming. Generally, the RPG mechanics are kind of alright. I don't have a whole lot to say about them, and I'd argue this is the last RPG Bethesda ever made, as both Skyrim and Fallout 4 stripped out enough of the RPG mechanics that I'd categorize them as action-adventure and action-shooter games respectively. Fallout 3 retains the skill and special system, and credit where it's due, those things can be used in dialogue from time to time. They didn't strip that out completely, it's just not utilized anywhere near the levels they should. I think the big thing to mention here is the removal of traits, which is unfortunate, and I'm not entirely sure why they did it. For anyone who doesn't know, traits are an additional character building option that are chosen at the start of the game. They add both a positive and negative effect to your character, and could alter the way you play the game as a result, such as Built to Destroy, which gives you 3% bonus to your critical hit chance, but the cost is your weapons degrade 15% faster. Or Four Eyes, which grants a bonus of 2 perception when wearing glasses, but the cost is -1 to perception if you're not wearing glasses. Ultimately, I don't personally use traits just because I'm not fond of dealing with the negative impact of them. It's just not worth it to me for the same reason I don't use chems in these games, because I don't want to risk my character getting addicted, but traits are still an aspect of these games that gives more choice in how you build your character and play the game, and they're totally optional, so people who do enjoy them can use them, and those who don't aren't required to. I like the addition of the radio. Even if it does somewhat conflict with the tone of the game, it makes total sense that people would try to re-establish radio stations for the sake of communication. It's just a bit disappointing they didn't do a whole lot with it. There's GNR on the Enclave station, there's Agatha station if you do her quest, and there's a bunch of smaller towers replaying old messages from when the bombs dropped, which could tell little isolated stories of people who tried to survive after the war, but I think there could have been some benefit to having another radio station or two. Maybe a rival to GNR or something. Ultimately, Fallout 3 is an incredibly flawed game. Its main story is complete garbage, its world building varies between barely existing to being incredibly fucking stupid and broken, and most of its side quests are mediocre at best. It seems as though Bethesda tried to play it safe, though I'd argue that playing it safe is an oxymoron. It's not playing it safe when you're trampling lore for no good reason, or completely changing factions without putting in the groundwork to get them into the positions you want. I still can't pin down whether it's a lack of attention to the source material, incompetence, or just a general lack of care. Don't assume malice when stupidity will suffice. But at least with the Brotherhood, Bethesda outright acknowledges that what they're doing with them is antithetical to what the Brotherhood used to be, and this is evidenced by the fact that the Outcasts exist, which uphold the true Brotherhood beliefs, and that one of the scribes will tell you outright that the West Coast Brotherhood has cut them off as a result of their deviation from their mission and goals. I suppose if your reasoning for playing this game is to shoot some enemies and I guess enjoy the atmosphere, then that's fine. But if you want to get anything out of it story-wise, then I'm afraid it's about as barren as the Capital Wasteland itself. Fallout 3 could have been a great fucking game if it had been given the proper attention and detail, but what we got instead feels like a high-budget fan project. I still stand by my statement that this game could have been excused as a rushed fuck-up bastard child made for the sake of Bethesda planting their flag in the series. It could have been remembered as that one mainline Fallout game that had some pretty shitty writing, but still made for a fun romp around the wasteland if you turned your brain off, though you shouldn't need to turn your brain off in order to enjoy something. There's still surely more issues with this game that I'm unaware of or haven't found out about yet, too. During my streams of this game for the sake of researching and gathering footage for this video, Someone in chat had said there's some big issues with Evergreen Mills, which I didn't end up covering in this video. As it is, this video took way longer to make than I expected, and it's turned out to be a lot longer than I expected too. I might not have many videos under my belt right now, but this ended up being my single longest script to date, even surpassing part 2 of the Fallout 4 analysis and the original second part of my response to Many a True Nerd. So I didn't end up covering a lot of other things, such as Evergreen Mills, the Dunwich Building, Republic of Dave, or the fucking endless metros with service tunnels. But I think by this point I've made it quite clear that this game has an overwhelming amount of issues, and that it isn't very well written for the most part. There's a few rare moments where it shines, but otherwise this game misses the mark. Besides covering the DLC for part 2, I don't think I'll be touching this game again for a long time. That's all I've got for now though. For anyone who made it this far, thank you for watching. It is greatly appreciated.